Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagan. It is Thursday, April 9th, in the middle of the day. People are wondering what's going on, what's happening. Well, I'll tell you what's going on. It's Holy Thursday, and that means tomorrow is Good Friday. After that is Holy Saturday and Pascha. So, obviously, Dimitri and I will be good Orthodox Christians and we'll be attending all of the services. We'll be keeping to the fast and we will be remembering the death, torture, and descent into Hades, and of course, subsequent resurrection of Christ, which saved us and every human being that has ever lived and ever will live. So, if that's not your priority this weekend, then I recommend changing that. Of course, we're still here to discuss World War III. We're here to discuss the ceasefire. We're here to discuss what we think is going to happen next, which is why you all tune into the show. So don't worry. But I hope everybody has been enjoying their Holy Week, attending as many services as possible, getting into the remember in the, somber mindset that the remembrance of Christ's passion compels us to. So thank you everyone for tuning in. I see we've got some people e-war mapping, several other people in the chat. Be sure to share the stream, like the stream, whether you're watching on Substack, X, or YouTube. Please give this stream a like. I'm about to do the shilling of our plugs and whatnot. Before we hop right into things, of course, we're going to be discussing the ceasefire that has been announced, the upcoming negotiations in Pakistan that American time should be supposedly beginning within the next few hours, and of course, the horrible massacre by the Jewish IAF against so many civilians in Lebanon, 300 plus dead as of the time of this live stream. So we're going to be discussing all of that and so much more. Turkey, Russia, the Strait of Hormuz, and all of that. So thank you all so much for tuning in. But before I do the plugs, Dimitri, how are you doing?
Yeah, doing amazing, Conrad. Hello to all the dear live listeners here on all the platforms, YouTube, Substack. I don't want to discriminate. There's some people on X watching as well, and it has been a super eventful week, as we all know. We've been all following it very closely. Truthfully, it is the great and holy week right before Easter. It is a very difficult day. I mean, during this time, literally, we remember the betrayal, Judas's betrayal of Christ and his crucifixion, the way that he was handed up, the God man was handed up, an innocent person, to the Sanhedrin to be dealt with. And in a way, Iran was also handed up just in the last 5 weeks or so to by the international community, by the so-called, global League of Nations that love human rights, etc., handed up to Israel and the U.S. to be abused and harassed, and almost nobody stood up for them, just as almost nobody stood up for Christ, especially in the Garden of Gethsemane, except Peter and the other apostles who stayed by his side. In any case, I think religious analogies from an Orthodox Christian perspective are always appropriate, especially when they have to do with specifically this region of the world from which much of our Holy Scripture actually comes from, if not all of it, really. And yes, it has been an incredibly huge week. I think there's a lot of different perspectives, and some of which we may definitely talk about in quite a bit of detail here and have our listeners join in as well. So thank you, Conrad, for having me.
No, thank you for taking the time here in the middle of Holy Week. I know it's early morning for you, so here we are, and it's going to be a great stream. Obviously, people are kind of freaking out. We don't really know what's going to happen. Again, there are a lot of questions up in the air. Of course, does the ceasefire include Lebanon? We're going to be discussing all of this and more because statements are rolling in as we are recording this, of course. So the news never rests ever since the Purim War broke out, which, of course, we are now what is well over almost 40 days past Purim. Of course, it is nearing the end of Passover for the Jews. So much like they started this war, the murder of the Persians at the beginning of Purim, commemorating that event in their history, or supposed event in history, or at least desire to have committed that event in history. So too have they, near the end of Passover here, conducted another massacre against one of the nations, Lebanon in this case. So we're going to be discussing all of that. But before everybody locks in on the analysis, takes out your notepads to start taking notes, of course, we want to encourage everybody to support the show at worldwarnow.co. That's right. That is how you can get behind the paywall and support all of us. And don't just listen to the World War Now weekly analyses, but you also get access to the weekly premium show, Ether Hour, which if you click the tab right here, you get access to all of the Ether Hour episodes, including this one's actually free. So if you want to get a glimpse into what Ether Hour is like, check out our recent interview with Lebanese Defense Minister Yaqub Sarraf. So much incredible stuff in there, gem after gem after gem. We've been releasing a lot of clips of that, so be sure to follow us on the other socials as well. But we have our recent interview with Warren Baylog, recent interviews with Zainab al-Safar, al-Mayadeen, Hezbollah-affiliated journalist from Lebanon, reporting from what's going on as Israel's invasion was ongoing. Interviews with Jim Jatras, friend of the show, Gregory Hears, Anthony Westgate, Cleave to Antiquity, Andrei Afanasiev, Levon Vasadze, huge episode all about Patriarch Ilya and Georgia, among other things. So really check all of these things out. These are some of the gem episodes of the show. And not only we have these Ether Hours, but coming later this week, normally it would have been released today, we are releasing our Q&A episode. So if you enjoy the Q&A episode that comes up soon, be sure to get behind the paywall, because you will get access to the Q&A threads that can get all those questions to us, so that on a basically monthly basis, every 4, 5, 6 weeks or so, we put out those threads and answer extensively whatever questions you want in the form of another Ether Hour video. So be sure to check all of that out. Be sure to go to the World War Now Buy Me a Coffee. If you go to buymeacoffee.com/World War Now, you can support us for just a one-time donation if you don't want to get behind the paywall, or if you're already behind the paywall and want to keep supporting us, this is the best way to do it. Obviously, you should also follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. Subscribe to the YouTube channel World War Now if you're watching on Substack or X. Do that. And if you're watching on YouTube, obviously follow us on X at World War Now _ and here on Substack once again at worldwarnow.co. So like I said, tomorrow, most likely, maybe this evening, most likely tomorrow, the Ether Hour Q&A episode will be dropping. So thank you all so much for the great questions. I see a lot of you in chat, and I want to remind everyone to send in super chats if you want your questions answered in this stream, because normally World War Now is not live, but today it is. So you can ask not just me, like you always can in the Tuesday evening World War live streams, but you can ask me and Dmitry whatever questions you want right now by sending in a super chat, just like Jonathan Kelly just did for $5. Content on Holy Week, second greatest miracle of today. Thank you, brother. I too was just at the service this morning for the institution of the Eucharist. So all of the gifts that are kept for the sick and the suffering to be brought to them were consecrated, pre-sanctified today. So that was a great thing to witness as well. So God bless you, Jonathan, real patriot. $5 more. The dilemma of wanting the U.S. to stop meddling around the world and not wanting it to be because of the Club of Rome 10 Kingdoms agenda. That's true. You know, people talk about Greenland, Canada getting taken over by the U.S., and this other reshufflings are actually sort of about to turn us into a Hunger Games world as planned by the global elites. But thank you again for the super chats, Jonathan. Anyone else can send in whatever they want. But Dmitry, we probably just have to dive right in here with the ceasefire. As of right now, we know that the ceasefire has occurred right now for about a day. There hasn't been any shooting. The Strait of Hormuz largely still remains closed. Only 4 ships have passed through since this began. It was briefly open for about 10 minutes before Israel did its massive airstrike on Beirut, which again now has killed well over 300 people, injured over 1,500. So one of the craziest attacks by Israel on Lebanon in its history, especially in the past few years as the war there has gone on since October 7th and Hezbollah's defense of the Gazans. There's also reports that as the 60-day deadline for the disarmament of Hamas expires, Israel is about to resume combat operations in Gaza. So that is on the agenda. We're going to be talking about all of that. But the main thing that's happening right now is that Trump just reassured on Israeli TV, of all places, that Netanyahu supports the ceasefire and he's all for it, and we're going to have a great deal and the war's not going to restart. Netanyahu then immediately addressed the nation and said, Lebanon is not included in the ceasefire, and we will continue to strike Hezbollah with full force. And this is as the Lebanese government, the president and prime minister, Joseph Ayoun and Nawaf Sarah, they are preparing to completely ban Hezbollah. They're trying to enter into negotiations with the Israelis, and the Israelis say that one of the things that those negotiations require for goodwill is the expulsion of all Hezbollah and Amal, which are the 2 Shia major parties in the Lebanese parliament, expelling them from the governing coalition. So basically, they're asking for a complete takeover of the Lebanese government by the Lebanese Forces Party, which Hezbollah, Amal, and 1 or 2 other parties are in a coalition with right now. So Israel's basically facilitating that. The U.S. would obviously love to see that. I think they want a civil war basically to break out in Lebanon so the southern front is abandoned and Israel can do whatever it wants. So that's all going on. All the while, the big drama when the ceasefire unfolded, people can watch my stream yesterday with Kotel as all of this was unfolding live. We kind of reacted to it, but they The the Iranians and the Pakistanis claim that the ceasefire included a full ceasefire in Lebanon. It includes basically handing the Strait of Hormuz over to Iran, allowing them to charge tolls through it once they reopen it. It includes allowing Iran to enrich domestically as it was before. It includes no limits on Iran's ballistic missiles and even general amnesty towards all of their proxy networks, as well as the U.S. giving sanctions relief and paying back all the damages that were done for the deaths and the infrastructure damage during the course of the U.S.-Israeli attacks. So obviously, this is a maximalist. Excuse me. This is a maximalist demand, and the U.S. is claiming they didn't agree to that. In the immediate aftermath of the Israeli strike on Lebanon, Pakistan, who is the mediator of these negotiations, and Iran said that Lebanon was included in the ceasefire. Trump denied this. J.D. Vance denied this. Israel denied this. But 2 out of 3 of the parties that were actually in the room confirmed this. And it's clear that that was what Iran agreed to. So now the U.S. is balking on this. They're trying to get the Israelis to at least calm down in Lebanon, but we're going to see how that comes. Mojtaba Khamenei released a statement, so we're probably going to read that in a second. I know I've been yapping for so long here without giving Dmitry a chance, but there's just so much that has happened. Galibaf has said that we are hesitantly entering into negotiations, but the moment the U.S. balks and the ceasefire is broken any more than it already has been, then major strikes are coming. The rumor is that Iran was minutes away from launching a decisive strike on Israel in retaliation for the Lebanon strike when Pakistan intervened. So it's a bit disappointing, I would say, for the hardliners in Iran, probably, that certain elements are listening to Pakistanis, telling them not to avenge 300 plus civilians that have been killed. So before we read Mojtaba Khamenei's statement and some of this other news, Dmitry, what's your reaction to all of this initially?
Yeah, no, there's been exactly a crazy news cycle this week, and in particular, the controversial and in some ways contrasting positions being given by literally almost everybody in the first 24 hours. Obviously, I think you summarized it very well, Conrad, in terms of there were at least on the internet circulating apparently the maximalist Iranian demands, which I doubt very much Trump and his administration agreed to, specifically in relation to reparations. So you're going to tell me that the Iranian Persians received reparations before the African Americans did? I mean, that's 2026 for you. And clearly, like, that's not going to happen. Like, reparations, most likely for a war, which Donald J. Trump and Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu consider just and entirely, qualified the preemptive strikes, all those various murders they carry out, commencing from the bombing of the girls' school all the way up throughout the conflict, which led to over 3,000 deaths. I mean, how do you pay compensation for all of those? I mean, that's almost like, obviously, compensating a country compensating the US for 9/11, for example. It's inquantifiable, the damage that has been done to Iran, let alone the alleged destruction of the enriched uranium centrifuges, which Trump claims has literally taken place. He says that there is still like enriched uranium dust that needs to be picked up. And in general, Conrad, I think the bizarre thing was the week in a way commenced, a Great and Holy Week commenced with Trump's absolutely wild tweet where he essentially commences the tweet with stating that an entire civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. Is he referring to the fact that Iran has been, conquered and defeated many times throughout its long history, which the benefit of being, I guess, Iranian and Persian is knowing that you can come back from historic defeat and rebuild, sort of in some ways reassess, reform yourself and continue down the path of history. Unlike so many other peoples that have gone into obscurity, for example, the ancient Egyptians, which have existed for 3,000 years and simply have disappeared, and today it's just Arabized, basically. Only the Copts really hold any of that ancient lineage going back to the Great Pyramids and Old Testament history, whereas the Iranian Persians, despite a change of religion, despite a multitudes of foreign invasions, most of them unfortunately successful, but some not, Iran has managed to at least have that historic memory, that continuity continue throughout, and the culture never really stopped developing. That's why Trump refers to it as civilization correctly. And yet, when he made that threat, I think many of us, Conrad, predicted and anticipated there would be maybe a nuclear strike. Like this would be the Hiroshima Nagasaki moment, that Iran was not being subdued by the 4 to 5 weeks of intense B1, B2 bombing campaigns. There was probably, I don't know, who knows how many GBU 57s, like deep penetration bombs, have been already expended on these Iranian, underground ballistic missile bases. So, from what I understand from Russian sources, open sources, Iran had at least 53 ballistic missile bases, some of them as deep as 300 meters underground, which is, several Empire State Buildings deep. It's just for people to consider. 300 meters doesn't sound very deep, but it's not a kilometer or a mile. It is insanely cavernous, basically. They have 53 of these facilities scattered across the country that we know of, or that the Russians have found out from their allyship with Iran, that wherein they were producing these ballistic missiles that could be launched across the entire Middle East, reaching out and into even the East Mediterranean. Who knows how far, really, because we haven't even seen, I think, the full extent of the Iranian arsenal. And I'm not even coping for the side of Iran. All I'm saying is, in a way, this conflict ended, at least has been put on hold somewhat prematurely, but we'll get to that. The point is that America was trying to destroy those facilities throughout the last 3 to 4 weeks. They're heavily expending its taxpayer dollar paid GBU bombs to deeply penetrate and essentially defang and de-arm Iran. And I don't think this disarming campaign, Conrad, has been successful, because Trump, I think, in some ways was pushed towards the ceasefire by the fact that most likely one of the factors, I mean, there's probably several, but one of them was the fact that Iran was already beginning to strike at facilities that had to do with literally giving life to the Gulf state countries, right? So not exactly hitting all the desalination plants, which would completely take out the Gulf states, but already attempting to strike at energy refinery facilities, things like that. So the matters were escalating beyond the simple attacking of American bases in the Middle East, right? It was already especially the United Arab Emirates, which it appears, along with Bahrain, have taken like the brunt of the bombing. Interestingly enough, Qatar doesn't seem to have been hit as much as the other states, but we can get to why that is. Maybe is it because the Hamas delegation is still, I mean, maybe partially living in Doha? Who knows, really? What the in the past, when there were conflicts between the UAE and Qatar, Iran did get involved on the side of one or the other necessary country. So there are these interesting sort of diplomatic ties that exist there. But in any case, the peace deal coming shortly after that civilization-ending tweet, it in a way shows weakness from Trump, that he cannot carry through, right? He cannot carry through these insane threats of potentially nuclear level rhetoric. And in some capacity, it does show that most likely Iran agreed to the ceasefire knowing that they would still have leverage over Trump and over Bibi Netanyahu if the conflict was to be reinstated. So I think in the short term, we can definitely conclude that the fact that Iran has breathing room for 2 weeks, and this was the country that put under so much pressure, the whole shock and awe, the purpose of a shock and awe campaign, just like in Iraq, is to place a country under so much pressure in such a short span of time, so acutely, that they will come to the negotiating table, they will wave the white flag, and they will surrender. And that's not what Iran has done. And now it's received 2 weeks of respite. And who knows what kind of assistance it will receive via the Caspian Sea, via the various highways and freeways leading through Central Asia, and the airports, which it still has, no doubt, many of them are functional in the northeastern sections of the country when Chinese and Russian planes begin landing, and maybe, hopefully, Iranian air defense will begin receiving all those much-needed, no doubt, reinforcements. So, I mean, the conflict has been put on hold, ostensibly, but yes, there's still bloodshed, and well and truly, I think, as you said correctly, Israel carried out one of the most egregious human rights, and I would say just anti-human, anti-Christian, just satanic ritual acts on the, coincidentally, during the last days of Talmudic Passover in 2026. I mean, as I said to you off air, Conrad, well, Israel commits a human rights war crime. Let's open up the Talmudic calendar to see what holy day it is. That's just literally what you have to do nowadays. And I mean, that's unfortunately most of the time it does coincide with a certain feast day. The swinging of the chickens must continue. But yes, a very intense week, that's for sure.
No, I mean, it's obviously, as Christians, we live on the church calendar, but unfortunately, geopolitics and the world and the market, they live on the Jewish calendar. So, a clash of calendars, and the dates and the times, all very important stuff. But I said I'd read the Muhtaba Khamenei statement, and this is a statement commemorating the 40th day since the assassination of his father, the former supreme leader Ali Khamenei. He says, "To our southern neighbors, you are witnessing a miracle. See it correctly and stand in the right place. Be suspicious of the false promises of devils. We will enter a new phase in the management of the Strait of Hormuz. We will not abandon the criminal aggressors who attacked our country. We will demand compensation for every single damage and the blood price of our martyrs. You, the heroic nation of Iran, have been the decisive victors of on this battlefield. Iran stands today at the dawn of becoming a great power." So, obviously, somewhat positive about the negotiations, but still somewhat bellicose against the United States. He says, "We will in no way relinquish our rights. And in this regard, we consider the entire resistance axis as a unified whole." So clearly, they're going to be pushing for ceasefires and deals involving Iraq and the militias there, Lebanon and Hezbollah, and Ansarullah, the government in Yemen. So all of them are going to basically be being represented by the Iranians uh, in Pakistan as the negotiations fast approached. And of course, like I said, Trump said to Israeli Channel 13, Netanyahu is about to slow down in Lebanon, for which Netanyahu said, "There is no ceasefire in Lebanon. We continue to strike Hezbollah with full force." So that is that's the current leaders and statements between the two different leaders. This was very recent. A Saudi Energy Ministry official told WAS operational activities at energy facilities in the kingdom have been halted due to recent attacks. The attacks resulted in the death of a citizen and injury of 7 others. The attacks caused a total of about 700,000 barrels per day of production. So again, as we said, only 4 ships have managed to make it through the strait at this point, and the Iranians have said even when it is in theory open at the conclusion of a successful deal or even successful extension of a ceasefire, then only 15 ships a day supposedly will be passing through. So the idea that the global economy will just immediately recover is not necessarily correct. And the oil markets have been basically lying. The prices have been basically lying to the market and the traders because they've been anticipating something like this. Trump and his people behind the scenes have obviously been telling everyone that it's all going to come to an end soon and it's all going to be okay. So that was obviously why they unsanctioned certain Russian oil, but that's also why the Ukrainians started striking the Russian oil assets, because they knew that Russian oil would be able to be sold for very high prices and Russia would gain a huge windfall from all of this. So the Strait of Hormuz is what we're still looking at. And again, the obvious question now is, are the Iranians really going to just allow the US to take this time to prepare, regroup, strategize, take what they just learned in the past 40 days and move forward with a crazy new operation to get the uranium, to destroy Karg Island, to occupy and take the Strait of Hormuz, to kill the next supreme leader, to wipe out even more people? Who
Hmm.
knows what the strategy will be? So that is obviously on everybody's mind. Some people are, obviously saying Iran has won. They've put this 10-point plan forward that some people are saying is going to be the basis. So some people are thinking, oh, either that plan gets instigated or Iran goes back to war. But unfortunately, somebody who's just been at this level of war and witnessed what they just witnessed, and that is someone that's still willing to see what happened in Lebanon just yesterday and still come to the negotiating table with those people ostensibly, is I don't know if they necessarily have the fortitude to do what is necessary. Obviously, I admire them. I can't say what I would do in that kind of situation as my family members are killed by bombs, but I think unfortunately it will take more than just this 40 days of brave resistance to truly rid the region and the world of the Zog Zionist Israeli menace. So that's the
Hmm.
question there. But we have $2 from Solid Snake, Texas. Allegedly, Bibi is for a ceasefire. LOL. And yes, that's the other thing that I discussed on David Patrick Harry on the Cotel stream yesterday was, if Bibi is in favor of the ceasefire, it is exclusively because the Israelis were getting their asses handed to them in southern Lebanon by Hezbollah and the Redwan forces and need air support to be diverted away from Iran and shooting down missiles that Iran is firing because of the depletion of interceptor missiles, that those airstrikes need to be focused on Lebanon. We need to be dismantling Hezbollah because they're depopulating our northern regions, Kiryat Shmona completely uninhabitable, and they are dealing us insane military casualties, huge amounts of deaths, and even more hardware losses as hundreds of Merkava tanks are destroyed by anti-tank missiles and FPV drones that the Hezbollah units seem to have mastered. So if Bibi is for a ceasefire, it is for that reason alone. But we had a buy me a coffee super chat that was then, if you want, I guess this is a thing now. I didn't normally say this, but if you want to ask a question through buy me a coffee, be sure to at least send it with a link to the buy me a coffee thing in the Substack chat, and I will perhaps read it. But this is from Ortho Dixie, a big supporter of the show, for $25, says, I've been really amazed by the courage of the Iranians. They really mean their martyr culture. Even leaders are willing to die. As Muslims, where do you think this comes from? It does not seem to be animated by evil. They are fighting evil and bleeding for their people. Is it possible they get some level of strength from their reverence for the Theotokos in Christ? They obviously do not have truth or worship the one true God. How can they do this? Well, yeah, so obviously we believe that God, the mother of God, and the saints help everyone. They don't just help Christians, but obviously they help Christians the most because Christians call upon them and, again, have the grace to interact with such things. But look, everyone knows Muslims in the Middle East love St. George. They ask for his intercessions. All sorts of Muslims have had miracles from the Theotokos and the saints occur to them. But as far as the culture goes, ultimately, you can listen to this in our episode with Gregory Hears on Nikiforos Fokas. Ultimately, they extended martyrdom into the defense of the Ummah, in defense of the Caliphate, in defense of whatever the current Islamic State is. And if you're a Shia Muslim, the Islamic State, the Caliphate, is ostensibly represented in the Islamic Republic with the supreme leader and the clerical class there. So they understand that dying for the Islamic Republic to them is the same as us dying for the church, because they don't have a church. Islam is only really successful on earth insofar as it is instantiated in a state, and Sharia law can be imposed by someone with a monopoly on violence. That's why Islamic states have emerged, I think, have stayed in the way they are and tried to do this hybrid, turning into progressive while still having these laws, because from a Muslim perspective, the moment all these states become officially secular, that's sort of it for the religion, whereas Christianity, the church is able to withstand all sorts of nonsensical government changes. But do you have any thoughts on that question, Dmitry, and the
No, no.
ceasefire at the Lebanon stuff?
No, I think it's clearly Bibi is a very apt politician, maybe one of the most talented politicians around. And I don't mean to obviously praise him too much, but in terms of just raw Machiavellian pragmatic skill, he's probably up there alongside Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and the president of Turkey, Erdogan, right? As well as Donald J. Trump apparently is up there as well, given that his experience in politics is rather limited compared to these giants who have been around for literally decades, and they've manipulated, machinated their respective electorates and all these other power groups within their respective nation states in order to get where they are today and to push certain agendas across, and all of which they've all had their respective interesting struggles. And Netanyahu had a struggle with the Bagatz that still continues, the Israeli Supreme Court, which literally is full of Israeli left-wingers who have a completely different perspective to him. And now Netanyahu obviously has this very Chabad-Lubavitch-esque right-wing Likud viewpoint, which is maybe closer to somebody like Ben Gvir rather than the left-wing LGBTQ plus Israelis, the alphabet community Israelis. It's very interesting. Meanwhile, Erdogan has issues with the military, certain military elites, no doubt in Turkey, who still view, and maybe they have those sort of Kemalist perspectives, just referring to the coup of 2016, for which Erdogan did sack tens of military officers, hundreds of officers, from what we've heard. Many people got in trouble, and obviously the Russian Federation, need we say more, after especially an event such as the Prigozhin revolt of June 2023. There are clearly massive internal issues in all three of these countries. But in any case, I think listening and believing Netanyahu on its face is just extremely dangerous. This is a guy who preemptively has struck multiple countries throughout his tenureship as prime minister, and then has claimed that has been an appropriate pretext, because of terror strikes and whatnot. And he's very clever as well. For example, in his communication with Vladimir Putin, he makes references to Russia's buffer zones in the Sumskaya Oblast or something like that, and he compares that, that's what we're planning to do in Lebanon. Or he makes an analogy to Vladimir Putin's campaign in Chechnya at the beginning of the 2000s, right, the Second Chechen War, ostensibly. And it's just very interesting how these people function in terms of their rhetoric, how they're able to twist things. And these are very avid and skilled, not really debaters, but definitely manipulators, I would say, of the public conscience. And there is a very interesting statement, Conrad, just what you said about the Iranian regime. There's a lot of there's a lot of critics. I know the regime of the mullahs in general is like not entirely popular in Russia. I think that's because from the Soviet years onwards, they always viewed the revolution in Iran as a net negative to the USSR and the Russian people. So there are a lot of Russian geopolitical analysts who have actually been saying that the regime of the mullahs is simply unable to carry out a massive regional war. Like they're just not prepared because these are clerics. These are not generals. They may have some military experience. So they're claiming that there is a duality of power within Iran, where you have the literal military, sort of kshatriya, aristocratic Persian elite, and obviously even those within the IRGC fall under that umbrella. And then you have these clergy who are running the show, essentially almost like a papacy type system, these Iranian mullahs, like the cardinals of the Iranian Shia church, and they simply have some weird ideas. In particular, I've noticed a lot of Russians have actually been incredibly critical of the fatwa banning any development of nuclear weaponry in Iran. They've stated if Iran in secret developed nuclear weapons, that could have acted as a deterrence, and they should have done that in the early 2000s, maybe under the Obama years, for example. They could have maybe snuck that through instead of, for example, wing clipping themselves and now preventing themselves from amply, defending their own interests in the Middle East. And so there's all kinds of different perspectives on the regime in Iran. The point is that absolutely the Iranians do, and they have developed this idea ever since, the country's conversion effectively to Shia Islam, even when they had the dualistic, almost symphonia type model of Shahs and Mullahs working together prior to this post of Supreme Leader being created in the late 20th century. They did have this model of, well, we are the Ummah, we are actually the rightful followers of the correct form of Islam, and we have to fight these some certain infidels who obviously occupy Mecca, Medina, in the Arab tribes there. Clearly, most of the Middle East was for a long time throughout Iran's Shia history occupied by the Ottoman Empire, which was Sunni Muslim. So there's all of these interesting layers to the conversation of how exactly does Iran view itself eschatologically and historically. I mean, even Iran's eschatology does not match that of the Sunni Muslims. And in particular, I have to just cite that the radical Sunni Muslims in particular, maybe even the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, despite his links to, degenerates such as Jeffrey Epstein and all these others, most likely they have a completely different view of what the end game needs to look like for the Middle East. And we know the roots of Salafism, Wahhabism, the support of the Gulf state countries for terrorist radical groups within. I mean, they appear to be liberal and pro-Israeli, pro-American, but behind the scenes they still support these radical Sunni Muslim, very anti-Shia, anti-Iranian groups in the first place. So the Muslim world is not united at all, which makes the conversion of all these various influences, be it the Tates or Sneeko or whomever, to Islam even more suspicious, almost like a psyop in and of itself, simply because Islam does not have that same power in the world as many other religions, simply because it is so split and disunified. And Shia Islam at the moment is having its heyday in terms of it's actually defending the rights of its respective people, defending the sovereignty of the Lebanese people. Iran, the Iranian regime, is actually defending the entire civilization of Iran throughout its history, and Trump has positioned himself to be literally that shaitan figure, the sort of satanic embodiment of a foreign invader who wishes to dislodge the entire nation and basically disrupt it. And there are claims, obviously from within think tanks in America, where they say, well, we need to create a Balochistan, a Kurdistan, we need to break Iran up. Because that's the interesting thing, Conrad. Despite all of the regime changes in Iran throughout the centuries, Iran as a solid nation-state empire with many different ethnicities living within had remained unified. It never had this sort of break-up moment similar to what we saw in Syria or, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, which literally shattered into little pieces, or the Holy Roman Austro-Hungarian Empire. It hasn't happened to Iran yet. And clearly we know that the globalists, the liberals, the liberal elites and the Talmudic elites wish that upon the Russian Federation as well. They wish to break it up into mini-states. I mean, they've said as much ever since Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. I mean, it's been stated over and over again. That appears to be maybe one of the long-term goals that the globalists have for Iran. But notice, Conrad, the special combat operation of Epic Fury has basically failed to achieve any three of its goals which were set out. And we can clearly sort of highlight what the three goals were. One of them was essentially prevent Iran from enriching uranium forever. right? That's one of the goals. The second goal was to literally commit regime change in Iran, which is Trump stated that as much in the early week of the war in his from his initial speech as well. And obviously, the third goal was to keep the Straits of Hormuz open and not to have, well, this is from the U.S. and the Gulf state perspective, not have the Iranians hold so much leverage over the Gulf, because again, if we make reference to history, and I don't mean to be Professor Zhang about it, to be fair, we were doing this analogy and making metaphorical references to history long before the good professor became public on the internet. But controlling various straits around the world, especially in relation to shipments, has been an aspiration of global world trade powers for a long time. The Portuguese controlled certain straits. The Gibraltar is under the control of the British. The Suez Canal was controlled by the British and the French, etc. And clearly the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Straits are like the reason why Russia went into the Pacific Ocean in the first place. And then, of course, the British Empire, with its Masonic Talmudic leadership at the time, armed Japan to fight against the Russians in 1904, 1905. Most of these conflicts are literally around shipping lanes, around this sort of Talmudic money trade and how it is processed around the world. I don't mean to say everything comes back down to the economy. I think as somebody like our good friend George Macmillan, he would sort of lead to that conclusion, but it is a major factor. I think the spiritual and the economic, because when you worship the golden calf, the spiritual and economic, they come into synergy together. There is a synthesis there for these people. As strange as it may appear, the material and the spiritual are well and truly united in the goals of these people. In pursuing world power in preparation for the Moshiach's reign, for the Talmudic tribe, and unfortunately the US, which is under their control, is actually all in one. There is no like contradiction here. And so the Straits of Hormuz, controlling those islands, it's still a long-term goal, which unfortunately I think most likely will be pursued after this 2-week ceasefire, no doubt. And I'll make reference to Igor Strelkov's recent letter, which he managed to write out of prison in Russia, responding to the peace, to not the peace, but the ceasefire between Iran and the US. Recently, he stated that obviously Trump has not achieved these goals. He literally puts his reputation as an American president and the entire MAGA movement in question by sort of basically reversing out of the threats that he's been making and essentially not achieving any of his local announced goals. And Strelkov also makes and Strelkov, of course, for those listeners unaware, he's the former defense minister of the Donbass, a very based right-wing, you can almost say one of the most powerful Orthodox Christian monarchist spokespersons in Russia today, with a giant audience of over 360,000 followers on Telegram, despite never receiving an audience on Russian mainstream television. So his other perspective was that clearly there's been some pressure by China on Iran in order to, again, secure global trade. China most likely was experiencing some economic fallback, which obviously hasn't felt yet because it's only been several weeks, but perhaps there was pressure on Iran through Pakistan, and we know Pakistan is influenced by, in some ways, not India, but certainly Pakistan falls under the regional influence of both China, the Gulf states, and some people say the political elites in Pakistan. And this is related to the Afghanistan war of the United States. The CIA and the Pakistani intelligence, they somewhat have to work closely. Goes back to how Obama even managed to take out Osama bin Laden in 2011 and all these other massive questions. I mean, the creation of the Taliban, the Mujahideen, etc. So Pakistan it's a very shadowy country to begin with. No offense to any Pakistani listeners. It's also, by the way, just a reference to Father Andrei Tkachov, he made reference to Pakistan as the most difficult country on earth to evangelize in the Orthodox Christian faith. Like, Orthodox Christians face the harshest rates of harassment and proselytism to, unfortunately, Islamic Pakistanis. To have them convert to Orthodox Christianity is incredibly difficult. Evangelization in the faith is very hard there. So Pakistan is not like Oman. Oman is a trained mediator nation. This is the country that mediated between the Houthis and the other Gulf states during this Saudi and UAE obviously invasion of Yemen, which secured essentially the existence of the Houthis. Oman is in some ways almost like the Switzerland of the Middle East and the Sea of Arabia. So they have that sort of reputation. Pakistan, I'm not too sure. I mean, I know Pakistan, with all its with attempts to join BRICS and all of that, has aspirations to become this sort of almost Security Council level nation, given its nuclear power and nuclear weaponry. But it still has to grow to that extent, and I don't think it has the necessary independence, especially if you consider Imran Khan's imprisonment and all of those, and essentially Pakistan's involvement in the Afghanistan war. I think Pakistan still is a heavily influenced country. So the question is, who was pushing those Pakistani generals and field marshals, as well as their new prime minister, into organizing the ceasefire on behalf of Iran? Was it just national sovereign interest? I doubt that very much. Pakistan is, I don't think it's that powerful of a nation yet to make those independent decisions, which I'm not saying this is all a big globalist ruse, but I think we need to take a deeper look into the event. And the last thing that Strelkov did say in his post, in his letter, which was published by his followers, which he wrote from prison, was that Israel will try its very hardest to throw this ceasefire, this 2-week period, into turmoil as much as they can. Whether or not it's, obviously, we haven't seen that many false flag black swan events yet, but who knows what exactly they may be cooking up in the dungeons of Tel Aviv. So there's a lot of prospective chances for this to go wrong. We haven't even seen, and God forbid it happens, but we haven't really seen any sort of Shia Muslim Islamic terror strikes on American soil yet. And we know that's most definitely the military-industrial complex, the deep state within the US, with all of its black sites. Most likely there is a faction within the American deep state that has been planning these sort of operations, similar to 9/11 under Bush. And why I say this is because in the first speech that Trump gave on the eve of Purim, Conrad, he made direct reference to the Beirut suicide bombing. And we know Shia Muslims did participate in certain suicide bombing operations in the 1980s against American and French troops in the Levant. And by the way, and I mean, much to their, as an Orthodox Christian, much to their, my admiration of them, suicide bombing in Shia Islam had basically stopped by the 1990s entirely. And even during this civilization level conflict, the Iranians never went to those tactics ever again. So, in fact, that was a very short stint of time, but it did result in the deaths of Americans in Lebanon and in the Levant, and that Trump made direct reference to. So notice, he needed a proper pretext to call the Iranian regime the greatest terror regime on earth, and to do that, he needs to refer to these terror acts that Iran has carried out outside of its, shall we say, immediate borders, not just against protesters, but specifically against Americans, and that hasn't happened yet. I think that's still a, no pun intended, trump card that may be played by the deep state, by the globalists, and their, literally Mossad assets, which are hidden in almost every single country. We know the collaboration between the CIA and Mossad is really, probably the closest that two intelligence agencies, work together. Sadly, we found that out after the 2019 Jeffrey Epstein debacle and so forth and so on. Like, sadly, America is not in a very safe place, domestically speaking, exactly because it will be used, no doubt, again, by this Talmudic tribe to engage in the Iran war again, because the goals have not been met. The Iranian regime remains steadfast. Yes, many leaders have been murdered, assassinated, over 50 leaders. We can probably count generals, field marshals, members, leaders of the besieged Shia militia, which is very crucial to essentially mobilizing the entire country, defending Iran against ground invasion. Leading members of the IRGC were taken out. Literally the head of Iranian intelligence was killed, which is like having Sergei Naryshkin of Russia killed, or Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, murdered. These are huge, towering, meritocracy-wise important figures to the Iranian military-industrial complex. And of course, the supreme leader himself, which is a clerical position, but he too held sway over the Iran's defense and its sovereign decision-making. So what the strikes against Iran have been very bloody. There's been a lot of loss in Iran. So I think it's too early, Conrad, to say that there is a victor or a loser in this particular conflict. If anything, this will provide breathing room, and who knows what the future extent. I mean, you mentioned boots on the ground, Conrad, the operation to retrieve the F-15 pilot. I mean, that whole thing, this is almost an X-Files Twin Peaks episode in and of itself. That is something that no doubt there'll be Hollywood movies about, and that entire operation is as strange as the Operation Spiderweb, or the operation of the pages. Very mysterious extraction operation. But overall, maybe this 2 week ceasefire will also give Trump an opportunity to assess how many more aircraft carriers do we need to bring to theater? How many more troops do we need in order to take these islands? This could all be a massive analytical gap that the US needs in order to breach those information holes that it does have, and then, of course, enact what we may see as a full-on invasion of the Iranian coastline in the near future. So I'm not saying that we should be celebrating. We should just very soberly analyze the situation. And definitely, overall, this is a good thing for the Iranian people. If they do have some respite, they can actually grieve properly for the first time without worrying that they will be hit by Israeli bombs or American tomahawks. So in some way, a 2 week period of peace for the Iranians is, I think, generally speaking, a good thing. But we'll see where all of this goes.
No, that's a good point, and as I made the point with Kotel, it can be basically a neutral ceasefire, I think, as far as advantage goes, if they monitor the movements of US forces closely and if they can capitalize on being able to rebuild, perhaps restart some of these and even relocate some of the materials and building devices that they could salvage from the bombed sites into new sites and start operating new missile production sites, drone production sites, missile launch sites. If they can
Mm.
recoup some of those losses, then it definitely could be described as not a totally retarded move, as some are calling it. But you mentioned China, their negotiations, what could have impacted them. Obviously, they clearly don't want this to drag on longer than it is. And of course, what could have motivated this? Well, a few hours, maybe a day before the ceasefire occurred, what happened? Well, an Israeli strike targeted the city of Kashan in central Iran and damaged the railroad connecting Iran to Xinjiang. The Iran-Xinjiang railroad line is China's land-based alternative to obtaining oil while the Strait of Hormuz is closed. So if this was damaged and those supplies were disrupted, and it seems that maybe they were going to continue to be damaged in the future, that might have prompted China to be like, all right, we need to get this strait back open. We need to start having more oil getting into the market so that we don't have domestic issues. And what else occurred just yesterday? Taiwan's opposition leader, the head of the Kuomintang, Chang Li-won, which is, again, she leads the largest opposition bloc in Taiwan. They are the largest bloc in the parliament. It's understood that whenever elections happen, they're obviously going to take over again. This is from Al Jazeera. It says, Taiwan's main opposition leader has used a high-profile visit to China to push for a dialogue with Beijing, invoking the legacy of revolutionary figure Sun Yat-sen amid rising cross-strait relations. Chang Li-won, chairwoman of the Kuomintang Party, laid a wreath at Sun's mausoleum in Nanjing on Wednesday in a gesture steeped in historical symbolism. The city, blah, 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 blah. The core values of Sun Yat-sen's ideal that all under heaven are equal have always been equality, inclusiveness, and unity, Cheng said in remarks broadcast live on Taiwanese television. We should work together to promote reconciliation and unity across the Taiwan Strait and create regional prosperity and peace. Cheng is the first KMT leader to visit China in a decade. During her trip, she also hopes to meet Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Yes, this meeting, I believe, has already occurred. So maybe they spoke, and maybe as a goodwill gesture towards the Taiwanese, towards those on the Isle of Formosa, they said, all right, we're going to try to get the straits open because you guys are struggling even worse than we are when it comes to LNG and oil shipments making it to your energy markets. So those are all some of the reasons why China really could have leaned on Pakistan, or really, I don't know if it was the carrot or the stick. I'm assuming the carrot, considering Pakistan did so well against India in its recent war with the Chinese jets. So I think that between the rail line and the Taiwan meeting, if those hadn't one or two of those hadn't one or both of those hadn't happened, maybe the war would still be going right now. Maybe Pakistan wouldn't have gotten pressure from China. Maybe Iran wouldn't have gotten the pressure it got from China. Maybe China stopped sharing intelligence and said that at the very least we need to try this. And if the US and Israel fails, then we will feel more comfortable supporting you all the way. Some people are talking about how when this one blows up, it'll be very hard for anybody to claim that Israel and the U.S. are the good guys here, which, again, I think we're long past that deadline. So this idea that we still need to be proving the moral high ground, I think that's sort of back foot thinking from my perspective. But we have $2 from Solid Snake. Dmitry, are you saying micro cults are a psyop? I really have no idea what that means, but what do you think, Dmitry?
Well, look, I'm not really sure what that question is asking. Maybe you can emphasize it just in the general comments chat. I'm not asking you to, throw in some more money, but you can, of course, donate to the cause. What I'm trying to, I think, say is that obviously, Shia Islam was very diverse from the very beginning. I'll just mention one particularly interesting analogy. One of the early Shia cults was, of course, that of the assassins, right, which developed literally in the mountains of Iran, where President Saeed Raisi was, where his helicopter was shot down between Azerbaijan and Iran. Those we cover this in our articles, which you should go in worldwarnow.co, read the articles which we translated and published from Nicholas Kozlov, Ritual War. There's so many interesting tidbits in there, including in respect to Iran and what happened in those mountains, which are very densely populated by members of, well, in ancient times, members of the Talmudic tribe, literally the Proto-Khazarians, you can almost say. So, Shia Islam does have a very interesting history. It does have, there's a lot of, I think, forces interested in Shia Islam for the wrong reasons as well. In particular, Freemasons. Freemasons in Great Britain, for example, they love Shia Islam. They think it's really cool. They think it's a little bit esoteric. They have a huge interest in it. In particular, they also obviously have an interest in Sufi Islam, but in particular, Shia Islam is always very interesting to the European. They see the various rituals of the Shia Muslims quite distinct from those of the Sunnis, in some ways more. So there is an aspect to Shia Islam which, and I'm not sure if this is what you were referring to, Snake, but yeah, I would say I'd like the approach that Jay Dyer takes on his shows, where he analyzes the various Islamic denominations and cults, and essentially states that, yeah, there are actual foreign interests in these particular religions. And I don't mean to make any sort of long historical analogy here, but I think it is quite curious that even the first supreme leader, the first Ayatollah Khomeini, he did in fact receive some sort of patronage from NATO Masonic France in 1970s, which is completely surprising. I mean, because we think of France as, almost like a after World War II, almost like I mean, a country which has received patronage from the US and other powerful entities in Europe, and it's really not a country which has proper sovereignty. But I think France, especially with recent appearances of President Macron, etc., has shown that it has its own independent. The Golem has its own independent animation, and it's very deeply Masonic, as Gabriel de Rochen's statements have also confirmed. To be received into the French military, naval, or political elite, you literally have to be a Freemason in France. This country is incredibly suspicious, and they also have notice France's I would say neutrality on the U.S.-Israeli-Iranian war is also quite interesting. I know the Charles de Gaulle is still present in the Eastern Mediterranean, but that entire and of course France's patronage of Armenia. So the French angle is something which many people simply have not explored. Even I think we would need to do a deep dive one day, maybe with a fellow Frenchman, into how exactly all of this relationship works. France has its own weird, somewhat maybe I would say tailored interests in the Middle East, which may not exactly coincide with those of the Americans in the Anglosphere. And I think America largely falls into that particular equation. I'm not saying they're not in line. Clearly, France is a Masonic, Talmudic, globalist nation that probably wishes for Israel to be expanded, but maybe it has its own terms into how exactly it wants Israel to do that. Also, France's support, even during its Roman Catholic years under the kings of France before the revolution, which country did France support very, very strongly and closely? I mean, specifically, they supported the Ottoman Empire. They helped build the Ottoman Navy several times. They've sent naval experts under the Roman Catholic kings of France to the Ottoman Empire in order to, for payment. They helped bolster up their military. There's a very bizarre history of French involvement in the Middle East, and it goes much further than simply their colonial aspirations in the Levant and Lebanon, and French cafes and French cuisine in Lebanon and Beirut. It goes way beyond that, and I think it's quite interesting. Who knows what exactly the French interests in Iran are? Maybe are they in opposition to the Americans and the British? But I think in any case, the clear victor from a destroyed Iran, I think, if we're speaking about cults, will definitely be the Talmudic tribe, I think, first and foremost.
No, undoubtedly. And we are seeing the French and and France are sort of the main flex player here. They're open to being part of a coalition to reopen the strait, but they, of course, they vetoed with Russia and China the demand from the UN to open it that would have condemned Iran. So again, they're the ones that are trying to play both sides the most as far as the powers on the Security Council go and all of those things. But the the French obviously they have more likelihood to be investing in Iran when these things occur. And Lebanon, obviously, they are very much invested because they're sort of still seen as the previous colonial stewards. So it's sort of viewed as a failure for them. But we have breaking news since you were talking, Dmitry. This is from the Kuwaiti army. Air defenses of the armed forces are currently dealing with hostile attacks from drones that have penetrated the country's airspace, targeting a number of vital facilities. And 14 to 20 new Lebanese towns have been attacked now in a wave of Israeli airstrikes in southern Lebanon. So all that occurred in the past 20 minutes. So you tell me, is this a ceasefire or not? It sounds like a Jewish ceasefire, which means we shoot and you ceasefire. So we've been living in that under Lebanon since 2024, and it appears that some other people might be under that. As far as who was hitting Kuwait, some Iranian sources have speculated those could be rogue Iraqi factions or rogue PMF from Iraq trying to attack Kuwait, because they've been very successful at that in the past few days. Apparently, air defense is also active over the UAE, supposedly intercepting Iranian drones. And remember, after the ceasefire was announced, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates attacked Siri Island and other coastal areas of Iran, in theory to test out, like, well, you might have a ceasefire with America, but you don't have a ceasefire with us. So maybe the U.S. will allow these ones to slide as well. Although the IRGC apparently has denied any attacks on Gulf countries. So again, this could be another repeat of the strikes on Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Oman, with the Israelis trying to scuttle the ceasefire already. So check out World War Now Telly on the Telegram to see all of that. But we've got some big super chats here. $50 from Paisios of EO. It's your favorite goy here. I wanted to tell all of you guys, because you are my family, I have been accepted into the monastery of St. John. Congratulations, Paisios. Paisios and I were talking about this last night. So I hope you succeed in prayer, and will be praying for us at the monastery. Dmitry, what do you have? What do you think?
No, congratulations, Paisios, and we wish you all the best on this lifelong journey. Really, it's a giant commitment, and hopefully it is entirely fruitful. I mean, in a way, you're almost transcending the worldly battle, and you're entering into an entirely new one. This is a much more dangerous arena than any, I would say, any battlefield in the world, that of the spiritual life. So definitely, and I mean, you know this better than I, no doubt. Invest in your spiritual life first and foremost. But we do appreciate, of course, if you continue listening to the show, as per your spiritual father's advice. Stay in touch. We'd love to have that sort of connection. We always respect not just all of our monastics, those who listen to the show, but also the novices, those involved in seminaries, monasteries. I mean, those links to the Orthodox Christian, I would say, clerical world and the monastic tonsured world are very important for us. I mean, this is only natural. Think about, for example, Dmitry Donskoy constantly visiting monasteries before making those major geopolitical decisions and analyses. And in Russia, monasteries always existed side by side with the princely cities, and they worked together for the liberation of Russian people. And I think now that we're literally working for our respective countries to be liberated from the Talmudic tribe, we have to work with those people in the monasteries in a spiritual way, in order to, again, make sure we are in tune and we aren't falling under any delusional influences. I think we always receive some of the best insights when we speak to monks in relation to almost any subject in the world. I think it's really wrong. I see this perspective sometimes from quasi-atheistic figures in Russian media, where they say, well, what does a priest know about geopolitics? Like, this is outside of your purview. I'll say, well, not necessarily. Like, Orthodox Christian monarchs have always sought the advice, and Orthodox Christian politicians have always sought the advice from spiritual fathers. Konstantin Pobedonosov, probably one of the most successful political analysts, pol sci people in the last, who wasn't a Tsar himself, who wasn't a prince. If we really think about it, in a way, he's almost like our progenitor, like our forefather. He is, on a spiritual and intellectual level, he always had relationships with monks, and even with later on in his life with Orthodox Christian bishops. And he's always consulted with them in relations to matters that impact not just domestic but also foreign policy. And having these discussions, I think, is a good way to go. This is a good, proper way to use social media and some of these media connections that, frankly, you're assisting us with. So we appreciate Paisios. We wish you all the best. Keep us in your prayers. I would say we will obviously keep you in our prayers, but your prayers in some ways are a lot more effective at this point. So God bless you.
Yes, we'll also all be praying to St. John Maximovich, the patron of your monastery homes. So, St. John, pray for all of us. $50 from Jonathan Kelly, many mitzvahs to Paisios of EO. Thank you, Jonathan. The World War Now family is all wishing Paisios the best. So, uh, what you can never say we don't have a good community here, the World War Now patriots. But as far as the latest developments, I think, if anything, let's say the war does resume when the markets reopen again on Monday, like Dmitry and I speculated is extremely possible. I'd probably put the odds at higher than 50%, maybe even substantially higher than 50%. Then why is this happening? Well, this is all about repentance. We're always reminding everyone repentance. I was at the monastery. The people there all know about the prophecies, and they were talking like, well, hopefully the ceasefire gives us more time to repent. And not only will it give us more time to repent, it'll give us time to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. And if this is happening, if there are no missiles flying, if the Jews don't have as much of an excuse to shut down the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, then maybe the celebrations there will be able to go on uninterrupted. This is from Ortho Christian. It says the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem reopened its doors to pilgrims and visitors this morning for the first time in 40 days following the easing of wartime restrictions that had been in place during the conflict with Iran. Israeli police announced that holy sites in Jerusalem, including the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Temple Mount, would reopen to visitors and worshippers following changes to defense policy and updated guidelines from the Israeli military's Home Front Command in the wake of the ceasefires with Iran. Hundreds of police officers, border police forces, and volunteers have been deployed throughout the city along major routes in the Old City and at holy sites to enable safe access for worshippers and visitors while maintaining public order and safety. The reopening came on Holy Thursday when the washing of the feet ceremony was held by His Beatitude Patriarch Theophilos of Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre Brotherhood. A considerable number of people had already made their way to the church by morning. Under previous arrangements, the Holy Fire ceremony was expected to proceed with only the Patriarch and other clerics and monastics, with no pilgrims allowed. A meeting between the Patriarchate and Old City Police is expected today or tomorrow to make final decisions regarding arrangements for the Holy Fire ceremony. So, perhaps for no other reason, we are getting a bit of respite for the celebration of the resurrection of Christ and the Holy Fire. We have $5 from eWar Mapping. Pezeshkian no doubt is involved with the ceasefire. Pakistan and China seem to pressure them into it. Do you think Lebanon will reignite it? So it seems that the Iranians, they would not have made it so clear that the Lebanon ceasefire is key to them. They wouldn't have had the Pakistanis made that clear. So clearly this was a real thing. They even had all over Tehran and the subway stations, these ads said, Lebanon, we will not forget you, right before they were about to launch that strike. So to me, it seems most likely that the Lebanon situation, as well as potentially some of these other situations in the Gulf, if the Gulf people decide to retaliate against Iran, that might scuttle all of this before anyone even ends up in the same room in Islamabad. But we have $10 more from Aaron Ehart. How long before the Mosque of Omar gets false flagged? Well, as was just discussed, the holy sites seem to be open, or maybe that's the even more unfortunate reality. Maybe all these holy sites will be opened so that people can be masked. Maybe there will be people at the Mosque of Omar when the Dome of the Rock is struck by Israel claiming to be Iran. And if a bunch of people die and they can convince people that it was Iran, then maybe that would help win people to Israel's side. There's all sorts of different options here. But what do you think about these two super chats, Dmitry?
No, I think in relation to what eWar Mapping stated, very clearly, Pezeshkian, recall last week on World War, or even this week, it hasn't even been 7 days really, but when the previous World War Now episode dropped, we did discuss at some point the various diplomatic South Caucasus meetings. For example, Prime Minister Pashinyan of Armenia traveling to Moscow, meeting in the Kremlin with Putin, Putin essentially almost in a way caricaturishly listening to him explain how fair and democratic the elections in Armenia are. I think the elections in Armenia are scheduled to be held in June of this year later on. And clearly Armenia's neighbor, Azerbaijan, President Ilham Aliyev, who's very deeply embedded, I think, with some of those mountain Jewish clans in particular in Azerbaijan and in Russia. They own and control most. If you ever attend a Millionnik, a large Russian city, be it St. Petersburg, Moscow, Nizhny Novgorod, Kazan, you'll notice most of the supermarkets, most of the massive big shopping centers are controlled by Azeris or mountain Jews specifically, including obviously Crocus City Hall, the largest shopping center in all of Russia, was owned by the Agalarov family. So it's very interesting how Aliyev is very deeply, and I think we saw it last year when President Putin literally sent, despite there was the fact that there were tensions between Azerbaijan and Russia formally, he sent a happy birthday message, President Putin personally, to Ilham Aliyev's wife. So the first lady of Azerbaijan. We have to just appreciate that Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, can still be carrying out some of these maybe bilaterally beneficial diplomatic messages to countries with whom he meets. For example, Bibi Netanyahu will maybe not meet personally with Putin, so Aliyev will do that on his behalf. I'm not saying Aliyev is entirely under the control of Russia, but clearly there could be these small favors carried out. So perhaps, as you said correctly, China pressuring Iran through Pakistan absolutely could be the case. Pakistan, remember, has these like multilateral pressure points. On one hand, it has literally a defense pact with Saudi Arabia, or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is the Sunni Muslim Ummah. As Conrad correctly put, if anything, Pakistan is the premier Sunni Muslim country having nuclear weaponry. It should it should have a huge say over the position of Sunni Muslims, but it has been left out clearly because of it's surrounded by much larger, in some ways, much more prominent, economically more prosperous countries that in some ways it is repressed in the way it acts in terms of foreign policy. Despite having access to the Sea of Arabia and having access to maritime trade, it's not a landlocked country, but it is very interesting. Absolutely, Pakistan pressured via China, potentially the Gulf states as well. Turkey and Saudi Arabia could have been involved in this mounting, shall we say, development in terms of speaking to Iran, perhaps putting forward certain suggestions that a ceasefire would be in their benefit. Consider the fact that Iran is the aggrieved victim country. It's almost as if in a criminal context there is a woman who was assaulted, for example, by a perpetrator, and you meet with the woman and say, okay, can you not press charges, for example? That's potentially, we're speaking at this sort of level, that's what asking Iran for a ceasefire could be leading towards. In some ways, it is somewhat disrespectful. You're asking for, in a way, you're not just asking for Iran to forgive the perpetrators of the crimes, but you are asking them to hold off before pursuing justice, which is a very interesting approach. So yes, Azerbaijan could have been pressured by Russia in order to, again, when Pezeshkian spoke to Aliyev last week, and naturally the elites of Pakistan could have been influenced by many nations, specifically, first and foremost, China, but yes, the Gulf states included specifically Saudi Arabia, potentially Turkey as well. So it is incredibly curious that all of this transpires shortly after. And notice Dr. Pezeshkian is one of the survivors of the great assassination attempts. And I don't mean to say that this is there's been an internal reformist coup within Iran, but he is one of the survivors alongside, obviously, Abbas Araghchi, who now at this point, initially, I believe when the election first happened, we had this idea that maybe Abbas Araghchi was more on like center-left, but it appears that he is fairly conservative now. He's definitely been shifting and changing in a similar way perhaps to somebody like Dmitry Medvedev, who was also fairly left-wing and quite dovish, but now he's become this new Zhirinovsky-type hawk in Russian foreign policy. So it is really interesting how all of these things fall apart. And just the response to the second question, yeah, obviously the Mosque of Omar, a huge Muslim holy site for both Shia and Sunni Muslims. For the Palestinians, first and foremost, it's what puts Islamic Palestine on the map, really, for the Muslim world. The main concern is, I doubt it's for the ethnic composition of the what's called now the occupied state of Israel. Obviously, that's particular land. I doubt they actually care, the Muslim powers in the world, they actually care about the actual native Palestinians. Most likely, they care about the prestige that a Mosque of Omar's destruction would cause to them, because it is the third holy site in Islam. This, it's very important for them, and naturally, any sort of, that the destruction of that mosque is in a way, for the Talmudic tribe, astrologically speaking, it's written in the stars for them if they want to construct a third temple. And that, I think, is an inevitability, whether it happens this year or in a decade. It's almost, and we know prophetically speaking, in a way, it is one of those apocalyptic final steps before the construction of the third temple, before the reign of the short 3.5-year reign of the Talmudic Moshiach. But it may only happen deep into the future, far away from these current World War III events which the prophecies speak of. So I don't mean to blackpill too much. If we, for example, see most of the prophecies which the elders spoke about now in relation to the retaking of Constantinople transpire, this may be well and truly without even the Mosque of Omar being destroyed. I don't think it's a necessary sort of element in the prophecies. It appears, but we always knew that the Temple Mount would need to have been, shall we say, cleared up before the construction, the Golden Gates could be opened of Jerusalem. And just as Christ entered into entered into Jerusalem through those golden gates. We're going to have the Moshiach. And coincidentally, the golden gates of Jerusalem still stay standing today, despite all of the monumentous change that has happened to. I mean, you can see the golden gates from the Mount of Olives. It's very strange. And Christ entered through the golden gates on a donkey. The Moshiach, no doubt, will ride in on a white or a black stallion or a white horse, to show that his power over worldly affairs, so to speak, as the Antichrist figure that he is. So I don't mean to sound too fear-mongering here, but I do think when we do see the destruction of the mosque, be it through false flag or some official demolition due to its age, for example, or some other perverse, weird pretext, not that we Christians need to, for example, defend this mosque, but just recall the Orthodox Christians, after the construction of the mosque, never called for its destruction. I don't think the Byzantines ever had the idea that the mosque needed to be destroyed. If anything, remember when the Roman Catholic Crusaders captured Jerusalem, what did they do to the Mosque of Omar? They simply turned it into a palace. They just reaffirmed it as a structure for a separate purpose, because they knew the Temple Mount in and of itself really doesn't actually hold any sort of significance any longer for Christians, even Roman Catholics to this day. So we Christians, at least we non-Zionist Christians, we Christians who actually follow some proper ancient conservative traditions, do not call for the Mosque of Omar to be destroyed. That's an entirely Talmudic, Pete Higgseffian take, which is completely foreign to Christianity, I'd say.
No, 100%. As far as Pezeshkian, I'm even skeptical that he ever was actually subject of any assassination attempts, because
Mm.
him and Aragchi both they go out, supposedly that's what got Larijani, he was seen at the big protest in public. They tracked him back to his place and got him. Well, they could have done that with Aragchi and Pezeshkian for a long time. And I'm sure Aragchi and Pezeshkian have been prepared to die and be martyred, and that what that means is that it would, any kind of, I guess, reformist situation would be gone. But we've already heard the reports that Israel was killing other negotiators, which again is this U.S. propaganda to try to keep the blame for the war on Israel. Who knows? But obviously, Pezeshkian would be more than likely the person behind this. Of course, Zarif, the infamous reformist who supposedly has always been pulling the strings in Iran to try to cuckold the Islamic Republic. People are saying that his fingerprints are behind this as well. So all sorts of questions. But the big breaking news that occurred while you were talking, Dmitry, this is from TASS. It says Russian President Vladimir Putin gave orders to the Russian armed forces to halt military operations during the Easter truce, but to be ready to respond to the Ukrainian enemy, the Kremlin reported. Putin announced an Easter truce. The main points: the Easter truce is declared from 1600 on April 11th to the end of the day on April 12th, 2026. So that is the end of the day on Sunday. Moscow expects the Ukrainian side to follow Russia's example with the Easter truce. Putin gave instructions to the Russian armed forces to stop combat operations during the Easter truce, but to be ready to respond to the enemy. So it appears we are trying to get an Easter truce here on the Ukraine front. Of course, this is from Ram Navarm as well. It says Ukraine says several drones were intercepted, but were approaching vital infrastructure in the country. One of the Kuwaiti National Guard sites was targeted by hostile drones, resulting in significant material damage, but no casualties. So significant damage to sites in Kuwait. Easter truce in Russia. Your reaction, Dmitry?
Amazing news from Russia and all of Eastern Europe, frankly. I think one of the reasons also, and this ties into what you said, Conrad, about the the holy weekend of Easter, all of these great events, Bright Week, and the Holy Fire coming down as well on Great Saturday this week. There is this tradition that developed, as most of us have probably heard about it, but it only goes back to the 1990s. Specifically, during the Yeltsin years, there was this tradition of, diplomatically speaking, bringing the holy fire from the Holy Sepulchre, so placing it into a lantern and then having it travel to various churches around the world. I believe that this tradition actually began in the Russian Federation. It's not a Soviet tradition. It's certainly not a Tsarist Russian tradition, which at the time of the revolution, planes were only freshly into development, so there was no physical way of actually transporting the holy fire. It is in some ways a new Orthodox Christian tradition of a small t, and that is obviously when the holy fire comes down and it's spread to all the various candles of the believers within the Holy Sepulchre, then Russian diplomats would literally take lanterns, light them, and actually travel through diplomatic airfare to the Russian Federation, and then spread the holy fire to the candles of the believers back home and to the lanterns of all the Russians within the whole Russian Federation, almost as a sign of Orthodox Christian sort of Catholicity, you can say. I mean, it's a fairly, I would say, cozy, nice tradition, but that would only be possible if, for example, the Ben Gurion airport will be accessible via no non-Houthi bombings, and there wouldn't be all those threats existing. And And notice the Houthis have in fact also adhered to the ceasefire, or at least even in preparation. Therefore, I think the last time the Houthis have actually bombed Israel was on the 6th of April when their UAVs and cruise missiles hit at the port of Eliat. Most of them were intercepted, but the Houthis did claim some of them did hit. Notice the Houthis, they do aim for very specific targets, maybe because their long-range ballistic missiles are of much older historical stock, going back to Soviet times. But perhaps the Iranians, when they give their missiles to the Houthis, is not like top-of-the-range equipment, because we are giving them to a paramilitary group, and I think even less so equipped than Hezbollah. But note that Houthis, they always aim at specific targets. It's the Negev Desert, Ben Gurion Airport, the port of Eliat. So it's specifically like they try to, of course, aim for Tel Aviv and Haifa, but those are fair distant targets for them. And the Houthis do already have prearranged coordinates, I think, for some of those prior mentioned targets. So it's quite interesting. The Houthis have also stopped shooting. So if the Ben Gurion airport is operational, the Russians will take the Holy Fire onto the plane and they will be flying that all the way back. But it is interesting that President Putin has attempted, it looks like Russia is attempting to have an Easter peace. In previous years of the special military operation, unfortunately, we don't really have a catalog of this because the news has just been so overwhelming since the beginning of the show. Really, it's been a real roller coaster. But there's been Christmas truces attempted, similar to World War I. There's been Easter truces attempted. They do not always succeed, and I think Russia being in the standing position, sort of in a way commenting on the Russian situation on the front lines at the moment, over the 1,500 or so kilometers of front lines in the SMO zones, you can kind of see that the Russians are in a dominant position to sort of stand still. For example, 60 to 70% of Konstantinovka is controlled. The Russians control most of Kupiansk, as well as Kupiansk-Uzlovoy, for example. The Russians control, they've just moved literally a day before further west of the Gaichu River in Gulai Polya, for example. So the Russians are in a controlling situation. The borders in Zaporozhye haven't moved. The Russians haven't retreated back despite the waves of sort of this new weird counterattack that the Ukrainians enacted along the Dnieper River. And so this is in the sort of, so to speak, the northwestern part of the front line of Zaporozhye Oblast. So in some ways, the Russians do have a very comfortable position. This isn't President Putin trying to sabotage the war effort at all. I think this is like a true sort of maybe Christian suggestion. I do wonder who gave President Putin these sort of calls to call for an Easter truce at a time when Russia really is in a really dominant position. It is a sign of good faith in some ways by the Russians. Hopefully Zelensky accepts it. I think he is certainly, given the losses of Ukrainians recently and the body exchange as well. The Russians recently this week exchanged corpses of the deceased with the Ukrainians, and the ratio is completely insane. It's 1,000 Ukrainian bodies, obviously in body bags stored in Russian morgues, exchanged for 41 bodies of Russians from the Ukrainian storage. So either the Ukrainians are simply not holding, they're simply allowing Russian bodies to just lie around deceased, or they're burying them in mass graves, or perhaps the Russians are simply not dying in the same numbers as the Ukrainians in the conflict itself. So just keep in mind, there's been a huge corpse exchange, so to speak, in the war, not to sound too gnarly about it. So there's it does speak to the fact that the Russians are, I mean, in a dominant position. They have been, all the statistics show as much, and they're really not going to be retreating. There won't be an anticipation of a Ukrainian counterattack. The Russians are in a good position to have a weekend ceasefire over East. It's completely logical, and also to receive the Holy Fire. It would only make sense for Russian planes to safely land somewhere in Moscow or St. Petersburg and deliver that good message of Pascha to the Eastern European peoples. And hopefully, some way, the Holy Fire can maybe transport itself as well by diplomatic cables to the Ukrainian Orthodox people as well, who've been suffering persecution. But I'm not sure if that can even happen. I mean, this is one of those cozy, small-tier recent traditions, which I think just shows that Orthodox Christianity is well and truly sort of a living faith that the Eastern Europeans can contribute to in developing and making it much more beautiful. So very interesting sort of time.
Oh, very, very, very true. And again, it's not exactly the same as the Iran situation. There was a bunch of momentum. Also, Israel and Iran are not Christian countries, but also, again, this is going to give the U.S. and Israel that time to regroup. The idea that one day for worship purposes to occur on the front line in Russia, Ukraine, it's not really the same situation. So no, I don't think this is some kind of problem, or he's not taking it seriously. No, I don't think that's, even if Putin isn't taking it seriously, this is not evidence towards that, even if it may be true. And we're going to get into the NATO situation, but this just broke. Israel approves record 34 new West Bank settlements. The Israeli cabinet quietly approved the establishment of an unprecedented 34 new settlements in the occupied West Bank in a meeting 2 weeks ago, according to the Times of Israel and I-24 News, the largest single approval of settlements by any cabinet to date. The decision brings the total number of new settlements established or retroactively legalized by the current government since it took office in 2022 to 103. By comparison, only 6 new settlements were formally approved by Israel in the 3 decades following the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993. The approval was kept under wraps during the war at the request of the United States, according to 2 officials that spoke to Ynet. All Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank remain illegal under international law. So Greater Israel just got a little bit bigger. We have some more breaking news. It says Trump and Israel both agreed to the terms of the ceasefire, which explicitly included Lebanon when it was brokered. However, the U.S. stance changed after a phone call between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, diplomatic sources told CBS. And Iranian Speaker Ghalibaf said time is running out, and he quote tweeted his initial 3 points that he said were critical and that were being broken in the ceasefire that supposedly was agreed to through Pakistani negotiators, which is that Lebanon and the entire resistance axis as Iran's allies form an inseparable part of the ceasefire. That PM Shahbaz Sharif publicly and clearly stressed the Lebanon issue, and there's no room for denial and backtracking. And 3, ceasefire violations carry explicit costs and strong responses. Extinguish the fire immediately. So I guess they're witnessing the strikes on Lebanon and everything else going on, and they seem to be now enforcing their own deadline. They've sort of turned the table on Trump, where initially he was like, oh, the deadline, and kept pushing it back, and now the deadline is on the other foot. So very interesting to see. $5 from Andrew Palamas. Blessed Holy Week, everyone. Any news on Turkey/Erdogan? And nothing hugely particular about Turkey/Erdogan, but I do talk about the Turkey-Erdogan situation extensively on my stream with David Patrick Harry yesterday. So be sure to check that out. It's on all the platforms. Just go to the Church of the Eternal Logos YouTube channel, and it's the most recent live stream, if not the second most recent live stream. So check that out. Obviously, Turkey is the next target for Israel. And actually, it's good you asked that, because we were about to discuss that here on the show. So thank you for the $4.99, Andrew Palamas. And 1 second. Yes. So here we have a recent statement from, actually, no, we'll read this first. Okay. So big news here. So this is from Dave DeCamp. It says the report, Trump considers pulling troops out of NATO, countries deemed unhelpful to Iran war effort. The Trump administration is considering a plan to punish NATO countries that the president has deemed unhelpful to the U.S.-Israeli war effort against Iran, the Wall Street Journal reported on Wednesday. The potential plan would involve withdrawing U.S. troops from those NATO countries and placing them in the territory of other allies that the administration believes were helpful to the U.S.-Israel war, far short of President Trump's suggestion that he may leave NATO altogether. The most notable NATO member opposing the U.S. war with Iran was Spain, which took steps to block the use of its territory and airspace for any military activity related to the Middle Eastern conflict. Spain is also reopening their embassy, their Iranian embassy in their country. It says Italy also blocked a U.S. aircraft from landing at an airbase in Sicily before it headed to the Middle East, and officials from several NATO countries were very critical of the war, including Germany. The largest opposition party in Germany, the right-wing Alternative for Germany, AfD, recently called for the removal of the tens of thousands of U.S. troops stationed in German territory. The Journal report also said that Trump's plan could involve using a military base either in Germany or Spain. It could lead to the U.S. placing more ground troops in countries closer to Russia, such as Poland, Romania, and Lithuania. Trump was unhappy that no NATO allies heeded his call to help the U.S. military open the Strait of Hormuz and was expected to discuss the situation with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte on Wednesday. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was asked if the president would bring up the idea of the U.S. leaving NATO, and said it's something the president has discussed, and I think it's something the president will be discussing in a couple hours with Secretary General Rutte. And so the obvious sort of question here is, so if he's all mad at these other countries for not helping, what about Turkey? Turkey isn't helping. Turkey is even supposedly has been struck by missiles and has refused to not get involved in this conflict. And then we have a tweet from Joe Kent, the former counterterrorism head in at the Directorate of National Intelligence, working under Tulsi Gabbard. He submitted his resignation a few weeks ago over the war in Iran. So he's been in the news recently. He's become very popular and well known. Tucker's had him on a lot. I mean, I've known him for a very long time. But he says, unfortunately, leaving NATO. He's quote tweeting a Trump Truth Social post that says, NATO wasn't there when we needed them, and they won't be there if we need them again. Remember Greenland, that big poorly run piece of ice, President DJT. And then Joe Kent quote tweet says, unfortunately, leaving NATO won't be to prevent foreign entanglements. We'll be leaving NATO so we can side with Israel when Turkey and Israel eventually clash in Syria. This is after he pleaded to topple This is after we helped topple the secular Syrian government and installed a former Al-Qaeda/ISIS leader as president. Time to stop playing arsonist and fireman in the Middle East. It's just not worth it. So he's speculating that us getting less involved in NATO will free us up to help Israel against their Turkish partners. And again, I'm a little skeptical, I think, because generally I think all this NATO stuff is kayfabe, and it's to try to increase NATO spending in Europe to generally make Europe more strong against NATO, more strong against Russia. Trump may have convinced himself, and he might think it's all about this America First stuff, but the people that are really pulling the strings, the Jews, AIPAC, the Pentagon officials, the defense contractors, and most importantly, the rabbis who decided the dates that these things occur on for their nefarious purposes, they, I think, are making sure that all of this occurs so that both Russia, Turkey, Iran, and any other enemies are sufficiently built up against so that the golem that is the United States can do the damage for Zog that it needs to do. But again, the idea that Israel is after Turkey next is obviously true. And again, Trump has obviously been fairly close with Erdogan in Turkey. So whether Trump will be the one that's in charge when all this goes down or not, I think, again, Erdogan is going to need to be taken out. I think that's how this is mostly going to go down. It won't necessarily be a Erdogan's Turkey clash against the U.S. in Syria. Trump is just too close to him. And again, if he was going to be rattling the saber against Turkey, he would have done it already. He's going harder against the actual Gulf states and Europe than he is against Turkey, because I think Turkey is an extremely strategic ally for the United States. We have nuclear weapons there. And in general, I think Trump wants to use Erdogan as a negotiator with Russia. You know, Trump, Erdogan, and Putin are people that can all kind of speak the same language. But the moment Erdogan is gone, then all of that goes away. And the sort of wall between the two major fronts in World War III right now gets broken down, and the wars unite. And then the prophecies are well underway. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what Joe Kent said and the NATO situation with Trump talking about potentially pulling out, or at least relocating all the troops to other countries, which it sounds like would just be more aggressive against Russia if you moved them out of Spain and Germany and Italy and all into the Baltic states, Poland, and others.
No, I think obviously the implications of that would be giant. And again, the question would be, would arise: what exactly would happen to the Turkish nuclear missile capacity, right? The base located just off the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, where the Turks do have at least 50 intercontinental ballistic missile launch sites with nuclear warheads attached therein from the Cold War time. So Turkey, in fact, the one of the major factors is it does have still that US-based Cold War arsenal on its territory. It's not just their membership in NATO, but also the ability of Turkey. It's not a nuclear country that has weaponized its nuclear energy, but it is a country that has always facilitated the US's sort of Cold War-esque aggression against the USSR and later the Russian Federation. And clearly Turkey is the middleman also in a lot of these Black Sea dealings. One of the main economic, I think, issues related to Turkey as well, which is, look, if there is any aggression against Turkey, we have to consider the Turks also constructing their fleet both on the eastern Mediterranean side, also on the coast of the Black Sea. They are building their own aircraft carrier, and they are building more destroyers for the Turkish Navy. So Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, in a way, is reestablishing its maritime dominance. It will take a few years for that fleet to come online, but it's very interesting because, keep in mind, one of the reasons even the Black Sea fertilizer and agricultural raw goods trade hasn't been disrupted by Russia, for example. This is how it's related to Turkey. Obviously, all the Black Sea maritime trade goes through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, which are controlled by the Turks. I would say roughly 3/4 of that are actually, so probably 75% plus of all the trade that goes through the Black Sea actually doesn't come from the Ukrainian ports, the 3 ports in the Odessa Oblast and the ports of Nikolaev and Kherson. They actually come from the Russian Novorossiysk port. So the east coast, certainly the east coast of the Black Sea belonging to Russia, that's where most of the trade actually does come from, most of the raw goods, fertilizer, etc. Things which, as we mentioned with Conrad, if the Straits of Hormuz are disrupted, the Bab el-Mandeb Straits are disrupted, and the Bosphorus Dardanelles all at the same time, through some major regional conflict, you will see literally mass starvations and famines around the world due to almost a complete absence of fertilizer, just these various chemicals that nations use in order to produce basic goods and basic foods. So if Turkey is somehow involved in a future regional conflict, as Joe Kent suggests, what would happen if the U.S. would leave NATO? I mean, this is a major question. Clearly, Israeli Greek aggression against the Turks is like almost guaranteed. Erdogan has said as much in his preparation. He said, "We are building the Steel Dome, an air defense system." Notice Iran doesn't have the Iranian anti-air capacity. It appears wasn't on the same level of either the Iron Dome or even, we can almost say, like the Turks. I mean, they have their own Ceasefire anti-air missile launchers, which are different from the S-400, S-500. In some way, they're maybe even related. So the Turks, you can say, are almost more prepared for an aerial campaign than the Iranians were. And I think they're looking into that long-term aggression against their own country. I think Erdogan, he wants to make it his own legacy that he will strengthen the country rather than weaken it. And that's why he's holding this very interesting peacetime sort of middleman position, both in the Russo-Ukrainian trade conflict in the Black Sea, but also in the Middle East. Notice Erdogan was one of the people that did welcome the ceasefire, which again raises questions. Was Erdogan on behalf of the Turkish deep state, as well as Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, were these two Sunni Muslim countries part of the equation in sort of putting some pressure on Pakistan to make those sort of discussions with Iran take place? I mean, very possibly. It looks like Erdogan is on the same page as the Pakistanis. And remember, Turkey was the country that proposed to include Pakistan into BRICS, which India vetoed. So again, that relationship between Pakistan and Turkey, very interesting. Pakistan being a nuclear powered state with nuclear weaponry, Turkey isn't. So it's a very interesting relationship there. But I think generally speaking, it is inevitable. One of the main conflictual points within the former NATO conglomeration, if it was to collapse, Conrad, will be the Turkey theater. The second theater, immediately, I think, apparent to everybody, will be that on the Baltic coast, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Suwalki corridor, for example. I mean, there's already been an abundance of premeditated pretext. I mean, as much as we can say this has become somewhat of a tradition to have a special combat operation or a special military operation into neighboring countries which are misbehaving, as soon as, and I mean, one of the as soon as NATO collapses or disintegrates, I think no doubt you will see a Russian, and very justified in my opinion, incursion into at least Lithuania through Belarus, for example, in the Suwalki corridor, and that will maybe even go through certain Polish territories, which maybe Wagner was preparing for, since Wagner's positioning in Belarus. Like, what are they training the Belarusian military for? Belarusian military, by the way, has never been in any sort of war ever, so they have zero military experience. What is the Belarusian military preparing for? What are they being trained by Wagner to do? And that is obviously to create this ballast, this counterweight to the Baltic states in the future. So these are the two major theaters, and I think the British anticipate this as well, which is why the Crown Prince of the British, Prince William, made these where he would wear Estonian military uniform, and he had this like bearded visage, and he was there on the borders of Russia and Estonia just last year, I believe, or in late 2024, posturing for Estonian independence. I mean, the British investment in the Ukrainian conflict and in the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are very apparent. So it is quite interesting as to what exactly the Baltic Sea theater will look like. I think this will be one of the two main points of contention, maybe even, Conrad, in some ways. And I mean, this is almost in the speculative range, but I think if we follow the prophecies closely, maybe even the Baltic states special military operation, including Belarus, Wagner, maybe the late Lukashenko, President Putin, if NATO does disintegrate, will almost precede any sort of Russian aggression against the Turks, which will no doubt come and will lead to eventually the liberation of Constantinople for the Greeks, for example. Like, in some ways, the Baltic theater will launch into operation first, and thereafter the Russians will join in. So I think in some ways, maybe Israel and Greece, you can almost say, will weaken Turkey. And I mean, we are speaking well and truly hypothetically into the future here, but geopolitical speculation, I think, is appropriate. In some ways, perhaps Greece and Israel will soften Turkey up, or at least have Turkey more or less focus on its southern and western borders rather than their northern borders, which then Russia will successfully penetrate in the future war that is to come. And I think we can definitely see Erdogan with his rhetoric in favor of the Palestinians, and likewise that he sees Israel as that future threat country. I mean, irrespective of, obviously, Turkish trade in Israel has been well and truly active and abundant. despite the genocides that have, obviously come after the 7th of October of 2023. But very interesting theory, I think.
The the Turkey situation in the Balkans is going to become interesting as well, because just yesterday, the Turkish Foreign Ministry released a statement saying they accused the Greek government of persecuting and restricting the rights of Muslims in Western Thrace. So, that border region between Turkey's western border and Greece that's been accused. Apparently, I talked about this on Kotel as well. The Serbians, Republika Srpska, and the Serbs have been warning that Turkey has been arming Kosovar Albanians and Bosniaks against them, and accusations have gone back and forth in that direction. And there are prophecies that talk about things really starting potentially in the Balkans if all these things go down there. So if Turkey is going to be funding those people, again, that's another motivation for Russia to get involved if they want to get involved in the defense of their South Slavic brothers. But unfortunately, Srpska, Dodik, Vucic are close allies of Israel. So the fact that Israel will be involved in all of this. Greece and the Balkan Orthodox countries are unfortunately the Orthodox countries with the closest ties to Israel, unlike the Orthodox Christians in the Middle East. So that might lead to some very interesting developments, to say the least. But in the midst of all of this, Hezbollah has launched more missiles towards Haifa. Missiles have been fired from Lebanon throughout the entire day, with Hezbollah already carrying out more than 30 operations. So that's going on. And I mentioned those Saudi strikes earlier. We have more details. It says, strike on Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline has knocked out around 700,000 barrels per day, about 10% of its 7 million BPD maximum capacity, hitting the kingdom's only bypass to the Strait of Hormuz. So they hit again, Saudi Arabia and the UAE had been using these pipelines they've built to transport the oil over to the Red Sea to get them up to the Suez Canal or down through the Bab el-Mandeb or somewhere else where they can be shipped around the world. This goes on. This is from CIG. It says, separately, attacks on upstream fields have cut about 600,000 BPD in production, roughly 7.5% of Saudi Arabia's pre-war output, which is around 8.8 million BPD. And likely to fall primarily on exports, which are running at about 4.2 to 4.6 million BPD in early April. According to the Saudi press agency, the kingdom's official state news outlet, recent attacks have caused widespread damage across the energy sector. Pumping station on the east-west pipeline hit, cutting around 700,000 barrels. The petrol line had been ramped up to full capacity in mid-March to sustain exports during the Hormuz destruction, far above its typical peacetime flow of 1 to 2 million barrels per day. Manifa field, which is the major offshore heavy crude source, was hit, which cost another 300,000 barrels per day, as was the Kurais field, one of their largest onshore fields, which is producing about 300,000 barrels per day. The Satorp refinery, the Ras Tanura, the Samref, and the Riyadh refinery, those all total up to over 1.5 million barrels per day together. The Juyam processing and export gas infrastructure hub has been hit by different fires. So LPG and NGL flows from one of the world's largest facilities, which produced 1.1 million barrels per day of NGL processing capacity, and LPG exports averting around 450,000 tons per month, a key supply chain for Asian markets. 1 worker was killed, 7 injured in the recent attacks, as I said earlier. So again, this is stuff that has nothing to do with the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz could be wide open. It doesn't rebuild those millions and millions of barrels per day of the capacity that have now been disrupted by these strikes. So the economy is eventually going to have to face these realities. They can track Trump's statements and go with vibes and assume people are buying Trump's bullshit for as much as they want. But when the boats actually arrive with the oil, they're going to have to pay these prices. And eventually the market's going to be forced to reflect that, and people are going to start to panic. So again, this is all in the midst of the fact that the time is running out to stop the Lebanon war, because the Israelis have said they have no intention of stopping it. The Iranians have said that's a red line. Time is now running out. It is already Friday in Pakistan. It's the morning time, but the question becomes, what are these negotiations going to look like? So what do you think comes next, Dmitry, as oil infrastructure is damaged outside of the Strait of Hormuz? The Strait of Hormuz remains largely closed, and Hezbollah and Israel continue going at it.
No, I think the sad reality is that Israel and its position in Lebanon is such that it will be greatly disadvantaged, especially if the reports are correct about the hundreds of Merkava tanks being taken out. We have almost zero information about Israeli casualties in the war of IDF versus Hezbollah in South Lebanon, but we can understand probably hundreds, thousands of casualties on the Israeli side at this point. Certainly many injuries. Many Israeli members of the Alphabet community are deeply traumatized by being pushed by their Chabad Lubavitch and Talmudic leaders deep into combat. So there's no doubt about that Israel will not be seeking to adhere to the ceasefire for as long as possible. I know there is no doubt some pressure from the Trump administration, especially those who still have some semblance of common sense, that Iran's call for a ceasefire does involve Lebanon, well and truly. And yes, we know conferences and international mediation sessions are without prejudice, and typically there aren't any like minutes taken of what exactly was said at those talks in Pakistan. But we can probably presume that Iran is not silly enough to simply forget one of their allies in the Middle East, one of their only allies, really, Hezbollah, and sort of leave them out of the equation, considering that the war in South Lebanon really did kick off to quite a fiery start recently when Hezbollah entered into battle. So Naim Qassem went for that risk, the leader of Hezbollah, to engage on the side of Iran after Iranian leaders were confirmed to have been murdered by Israel and America. And so Hezbollah is now well and truly engaged, not even as much for itself as much as for Iran, really, as an ally, as they promised. So in some ways, they are part of the ceasefire discussion. It's really interesting, the border situation. We understand there is a massive cauldron being prepared on the Lebanese-Israeli border. The Israelis are trying to surround the town city of Beit Jbeil, which is located just on the border of Israel and Lebanon. Just Bint Jabil's population is roughly 30,000, probably less now in terms of, obviously, there's been Lebanese refugees who have left, and there's no doubt about that. But just for size comparison, if you recall the Russians besieging, for example, the city of Taretsk, it had the same population as Bin Shpil. So this is a massive Israeli, you can say, special military operation, incursion in some ways. They do, and they almost have us around. Some of the war maps around Bin Shpil, they do show the Israelis almost coming around from the northwest and the northeast, almost creating this cauldron-like scenario, cutting this particular town off before heading deeper inside for a certain cleansing operation. So very Gaza-like situation in South Lebanon, no doubt, of all of the included war crimes. But I do want to note, it's now been confirmed that over 254 people were killed in that one intense day this week of bombing against the Lebanese people everywhere from south of the Litani River, Bekaa Valley.
Already well over 300, brother. Don't worry.
No doubt. There's thousands of injuries. And this is like, these reports, they get updated all the time. The most interesting is the photographs from it are it's literally Gaza level photographs from Beirut, which show literally parking lots being completely burnt out. And you have to ask the question, who exactly were the Israelis aiming for here? Was it like Hezbollah operatives, family members of Hezbollah members? Was it Shia Muslim parliamentarians? It's really unclear, but they did not care about collateral damage. So if there's a parking lot and there's a particular target of interest in the parking lot, they will literally drop the bomb on the parking lot, and whoever gets hit, bad luck for being in that particular location around the person whom you have no contact with whatsoever. So, and obviously Israel is not afraid of any legal international repercussions. There's already arrest warrants for all of their executive leaders in the ICC anyway. So there's complete disregard for any sort of international law, etc. That's completely out the window. That's been a long time sort of put to rest, that idea that there will be some sort of justice. The only justice it appears that can come in terms of warfare these days is like a Treaty of Versailles style, a Nuremberg style court or a tribunal over the defeated. And Israel hasn't been defeated yet, and that's because the Americans, unfortunately, the Trump administration strongly stands behind its greatest ally. And that's the saddest part of it. There will be no justice for all these innocent Lebanese people until Israel is brought to essentially some sort of accountability, or some sort of account. And sadly, there's just not enough international pressure on Israel from the so-called allied countries of Iran. Let's just say it how it is. I mean, Russia and China are, in some ways, they are providing soft pressure on Israel. For example, Maria Zakharova, Lavrov's right-hand spokeswoman in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, clearly stated that the ceasefire needs to include Lebanon. Like, let's not forget about Lebanon. Even Erdogan didn't emphasize Lebanon in his, recent remarks in relation to the ceasefire. So it's almost as if Russia cares more about the Levantine peoples than even their closest Turkic sort of overlord neighbors that recently ruled over the region just over a century ago. It is quite curious how all of this is developing. And sadly speaking, Conrad, I do think, the fact that the oil prices, they are spiking around at the moment. It's not exactly guaranteed that the straits will be open. This will be a huge I think, blow to Trump's ego if the straits remained incredibly congested. I mean, I think paying fees for transportation of these huge commercial vessels through the Straits of Hormuz is probably something that the Trump administration would agree to. But if the straits aren't open in the next week or even several days, I think it may put the entire ceasefire at risk of being broken, even without an Israeli black swan or false flag operation. Sadly, it's primarily because, as you said correctly at the beginning of today's live episode, Conrad, the American administration of Trump, well and truly, it does depend in terms of, yeah, there are the midterms coming up and all these other things, and it does depend on what exactly the economic markers are showing. And, the world economy is not doing well at the moment because of the straits.
No, that's the reality, especially in Asia, in the markets that, again, America, it's not necessarily affected by actual, "Oh, no fuel, no gas, no oil,
Mm,
we're energy independent," but we don't produce anything, so everything that is on the shelves, all the food comes from elsewhere, which has to get transported by fuel, so that's why America will be hit by the secondary ramifications of this, and the rest of the world will suffer, which that's how the empire works, the outlying satrapies, they take the brunt of everything, and, finally, when it finally starts to hit home with fairly minor things like price increases and shortages, then everything collapses because people in the heart of the empire are used to living in luxury at the at the expense of those who die for Israel, and of course the Jews are at the top of this hierarchy. Of course, a big narrative is developing now on the ceasefire itself, where the Israelis are effectively trying to make it seem like the ceasefire in Lebanon, if it does happen, is only going to occur because of the recent agreement by the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah and negotiate with Israel. And basically, they're just trying to keep fighting until the moment when they can outsource the disarmament of Hezbollah to the Lebanese government and probably American and other coalition forces. So, in reality, of course, if there is a ceasefire, it's because Iran is, threatening them and whatnot. But everyone's trying to save face, and Israel is trying to make it clear that if Hezbollah keeps striking, oh, they're going against the Lebanese government's decision. They're part of the Lebanese government right now, even though that government literally just said they need to remove Hezbollah members. It's a big narrative war going on right now. So that's Lebanon is going to be what really decides all of this, it seems. But we have a lot of super chats here. $5 from Silversight. Do you too suspect BB of pushing the conflict to incite Trump to go nuclear? Example, continued attacks on Lebanon. I fear Trump's ego and low IQ. Well, I don't think necessarily nuclear bombs are actually necessary to achieve what they necessarily uh, wish to achieve. Obviously, they wouldn't even strike the infrastructure, let alone use a nuclear weapon. Like I've said before, I'm skeptical of the sort of mainstream narrative around nuclear weapons. I think they exist, and I think that Israel is likely to use them because they haven't signed any treaties. No one knows about their nuclear program. It's entirely secret. Some suspect they've already discreetly used small tactical nuclear weapons, but I think them actually being used by the United States. The United States has extremely little motivation to openly use a nuclear weapon. They're already damaging their reputation on the world stage for being the slave of Israel enough. If they just suddenly were like, yeah, we're going to use nuclear weapons, I don't think that's what Trump wants to do. And if they did, it would be brinksmanship, most likely. Another $5 from Paisios of EO. What is your guys' thoughts on the CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou? And will you guys have him on the show? I like John Kiriakou. I think he says a lot of funny stuff, a lot of interesting things. But one of the things he said that concerned me was he basically believes the mainstream 9/11 narrative. He's like, yeah, Al Qaeda did 9/11 when we all know Israel did 9/11. It's not even really not even disputable when you look at the art students in the buildings and the dancing Israelis and all of the other connections, and then the lies about how they found this guy's passport in the rubble and all this other nonsense. So that has me skeptical. But he's Orthodox. He endorses James Fishback. He's gone on a lot of great shows. He's very anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. So we've actually reached out to him. He hasn't gotten back to us, but we would love to have him on the show. Yes, we're very interested. $5 more from Andrew Palamos. When the boats stop arriving in Europe and other countries is when it hits the left to repent, Max. Yes, very true. There is always more time from God to repent, which is what any ceasefire or any lull in the fighting needs to be used for. $5 more from Israel S. Can you say more about the 80-year curse? I hadn't heard of that when looking at the prophecies. Thanks. Have a blessed Holy Week. Well, the 80-year curse isn't, it's not a prophecy of Orthodox saints. It's just a Jewish reality. They all believe in the 80-year curse. They don't think a Jewish state can last longer than 80 years. I mean, that's what happened with, that's how long the kingdom of David, Saul, David, Solomon, that's how long their kingdom lasted. That is, so far, it seems how long the temple of this state of Israel is about to have lasted, and they can't they can't seem to sustain that. And that St. Paisios did say that 75 to 80 years after Israel's existence, it would stop existing. So there are some prophecies that coincide with the curse. And again, whether that means Israel will be destroyed, whether it means the state will fundamentally transform, whether it means that Palestine will come into existence or something, I don't know all the details, but St. Paisios talked about it, and of course the Jews very much believe it. That's why they're launching these wars for Greater Israel, because they think if we don't destroy our enemies by the time the 80-year curse comes about, then we're going to be destroyed. But as I've said many times on the show, as many people throughout history, both real and literary, have done in attempting to stop a prophecy from happening, they go about taking the actions that lead to it being fulfilled, when if they had just done nothing, maybe it wouldn't have been fulfilled. So I don't know if you have any reactions to the nuclear stuff or John Kiriakou or that, Dmitry, but we're probably getting about ready to end the show here. So thanks everyone for tuning in.
No, it's been a very fruitful discussion, and yes, I agree. Obviously, the 9/11 narrative. This is like a mainstream normie situation, which again, it still needs to be assessed. But there have been many great, so to speak, alt media investigations into the event. I think there's no excuse for even somebody, and I think in a way John Kiriakou himself is in the alt media space now and being ostracized from the official intel community. Hopefully, as we know, you can never be like a former CIA guy, as they say, or in relation to Joe Kent, for example, Delta Force operative. But look, putting our sort of biases aside, I think it's just one of those sticking points. Many people have one or two issues which they simply never become, so to speak, red-pilled on, sadly. But in any case, I think the nuclear scenario, I honestly did believe that, if there was a clear target for Donald J. Trump and Bibi Netanyahu to pressure to actually strike against Iran in a nuclear type way. I mean, in a way, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not really, they aren't Tokyo in a way, but they still were chosen as targets selected during the Second World War by the American leadership. So in a way, is there a particular military base or city location, perhaps one of the islands in the Strait of Hormuz, for example? And yes, somebody correctly did say in the comments that nuclear fallout isn't as destructive, it seems, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki as we were told that it could be. So in a way, if the nuclear option was available in order, again, to bolster Trump's ego, or to enact more of a shock and awe effect, because one thing launching at nighttime when mind you, there isn't any footage of these B-1, B-2 bombers or B-52s dropping tonnage over Iran in the Zagros Mountains trying to hit any one of these 53 underground ballistic missile facilities. So we don't have any sort of 4K footage of American power. American power is being hidden by like nighttime assassin-like strikes against Iran. So there isn't any of that cinematic effect. So in a way, you could almost say like a shock and awe strike against Iran could include like a mushroom cloud during the day. Yes, I think that's hypothetically possible. But also, think about it, Israel also has nuclear weaponry. It's just, I think, for the Talmudic tribe to strike first, for the Zionist Israelis, it would be, I think, an entire collapse of their any sort of remaining international clout that they do have, any sort of goodwill that Israel may have remaining with anyone around the world will completely evaporate if they are the first to use nuclear weaponry in any capacity. So I think they will blame the Goyim. They will have the White Crusader, Pete Hegseth, the Jerusalem cross on his chest. They will have him do that. And they will have Donald J. Trump they will have the white man carry out the burden of carrying out the next nuclear strike rather than have a Talmudic Israeli descendant of a rabbi do it, because that would be a little bit too on the nose. I think we're not quite in that sort of eschatological end time scenario where people are that stupid for that not to promote a hyper negative reaction. So in some capacity, if there is a potential strike, I do think also the hyper awareness of the Israelis and the Americans onto the fact that the Iranians are not looking to overthrow the regime. Notice the protests have all ended. Like the Iranians, more well and truly, it appears, to a large part, are uniting around national patriotism, which is pretty awesome to see that they're saying, well, look, we may disagree with the mullahs, we may disagree with the regime in power, but this is our homeland and you are bombing it for no reason whatsoever. We are not the provocateurs here. So that's very clear. And notice it, in a way, it even places the people who are disagreeing with the regime in the same camp as the enemies of Israel and the Trump administration, these radical. They do see them, it's like, so the entire Persian population, you guys are all bad then. And so maybe we do need to teach you a lesson or display the full might of this sort of globalist engine which we've built. So I think it's possible, but who knows? We'll have to see where this ceasefire talk goes. But definitely when Trump said we're going to end civilization, I mean, probably in the first instance he was referring to striking against civilian infrastructure targets like the bridge outside of Tehran and obviously electricity stations around the nation and all of the major airports around Iran, but also potentially could have meant more things than that. The desalination plants and remember, a nuclear strike, it's not going to, for example, from what we understand about nuclear weaponry, it doesn't necessarily serve as an alternative to a GBU 57 that can penetrate hundreds of meters on the ground. That's not what a nuclear weapon does. It's a broad radius strike against an open ground target. Which target in Iran would serve the purpose? What, Bushehr? Include what, destroy the Russian nuclear power plant along with it as well. I mean, to cause a Chernobyl. I mean, this is super apocalyptic, and it would need to be. The Iranians would most likely. Oh well, look, the Iranians probably won't do anything to provoke a nuclear strike. It will be a black swan event that does that. And yes, there is a second aircraft carrier that can carry F-35s currently hanging out in the Atlantic Ocean. That's the George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier. The reason I mention this is because the Gerald R. Ford is not able to launch, technologically speaking. Not all aircraft carriers in the American Navy are capable of launching F-35 stealth fighters, which accommodate the Diego Garcia and the British long-range bombers. The American bombers held in British airports. So the bombers, they travel from these long-distance locations, and then locally in CENTCOM, they're then supported by escorts of F-15s. They're supported by escorts of F-35 stealth fighters. So think about it. The Abraham Lincoln, presumably still operational within the Sea of Arabia, somewhere near Oman, very far away, hundreds of kilometers away from Iran for its own safety. They need more aircraft carriers with that capacity to bring F-35s and more aircraft carriers, especially these, some of these really powerful, stronger than the Gerald R. Ford, the George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier, if it ends up traveling through the Gibraltar into the Eastern Mediterranean and then closer to Iran. And the more massive ships there are full of American goyim, potentially the more sad hypothetical strikes of false flags or black swan events that could be carried out against them, especially when there's a condensed population of white Americans that could be ritually sacrificed. I mean, we have analogies for this in history before, sadly, 9/11 being the best example, going back to John Kiriakis. So all of this is a possibility for the future.
No, we truly do live in interesting times, and as we start to land the plane here, I want to encourage everyone, send in any final super chats because we're probably gonna wrap this up here pretty soon. It's been a good stream monitoring the situation today on Thursday, because again, we're not going to be monitoring as hard or going live or talking to you guys until Bright Monday, I believe. If not, probably Tuesday evening is when you'll hear from us. Bright Monday, we're recording a big Ether Hour with a very important guest. So stay tuned for that. Earlier today, Khawaja Asif, the Minister of Defense of Pakistan, he tweeted out, Israel is evil and a curse for humanity. While peace talks are underway in Islamabad, genocide is being committed in Lebanon. Innocent citizens are being killed by Israel, first Gaza, then Iran, and now Lebanon. Bloodletting continues unabated. I hope and pray people who created this cancerous state on Palestinian land to get rid of European Jews burn in hell. He sort of goes off the rails there with some nonsense about European Jews implying something about Hitler. But clearly Pakistan, they obviously wanted to negotiate this for the purposes of peace with pressure from China, as we said. But clearly Pakistan, obviously they don't recognize Israel. They're against Israel. So the whole Muslim world is going to obviously be generally hoping for peace. And if the Lebanon things continue, I would say most people, I think as they already are, would support Iran. And again, I don't know if Iran and Pakistanis and these other regional powers think it's really important to demonstrate that we are the moral powers in all of this. But I think the situation there is obviously evidence that if the Lebanon ceasefire doesn't happen, Pakistan will, in theory, be like, yeah, well, Iran is justified in their operations. We have a post from Trump. I'm not going to read the whole diluted nonsense, but he says, I know why Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Candace Owens, and Alex Jones have all been fighting me for years, especially by the fact that they think that it is wonderful for Iran, the #1 state sponsor of terror, to have a nuclear weapon because they have one thing in common: low IQs. So all these people, specifically Tucker and Alex, Alex, who stood by Trump when almost nobody did. Of course, now Trump's against him because they're all against Zog and know the truth. So just impeach this orange retard. Just get this absolute idiot out of here. I literally, like, even the fact that he's again, the fact that we've been thinking about this guy for 10 years, I'm so sick of it. Like, Donald Trump has played out. He's played out. He's anything he was good for is long over been overdone, and he is nothing more than a disgusting slave to the Jews, who is just an immoral freak at this point. That is an embarrassment that he's the leader of our country. And I know our country, basically, we have the leader we deserve as this evil place that we are. But boy, is it bad. $5 from Jonathan Kelly. Situation monitoring status. Time to monitor the Holy Sepulchre. It's time to monitor your souls and your hearts and make sure you're confessed up and you are fasting. I mean, Holy Friday. I hope everyone, if you feel the urge, join me. I know I will be taking a black fast. I think just water. I'll be trying my best to have nothing else for Friday and a lot of Saturday. So take that challenge with me. The not the Mark Wahlberg challenge. It's a different Lenten challenge, different challenge this time. But do that. I hope everybody is attending as many services as possible. And I hope that you all, if you have loved ones that are in Lebanon or being affected by this, that you're able to communicate with them. We're praying for them. We're praying for everybody affected in all of these areas. And I hope that everybody is staying strong in the midst of this Paschal, as we approach the Paschal season and Bright Week and feasting. So even though the world is in some turmoil, I hope that everybody is enjoying it. Do you have any final words, Dmitry, before I do the plugs and land this plane?
Yeah, just one final. Just there haven't been that many church news stories this week, but one in particular is that in the Kiev Oblast, there is a monastery that the Ukrainians are looking to potentially seize in the near future from the Canonical Orthodox Church. That's the Holy Trinity St. Jonah Monastery, located in the Kiev Oblast, so very close to the capital city, which we know is heavily controlled by Zelensky's gang. Literally, the mayor of Kiev, is a member of the Talmudic tribe. So that monastery was built in the 1860s by Saint Jonah of Kiev. So worth reading about that particular sort of recent saintly elder, and his relics rest in that monastery. So that monastery is probably in the crosshairs. And the other just response I just wanted to give, Conrad, is in relation to, clearly I think the Trump, yeah, you're completely right. He's played out his reputation. He's almost plummeted all the reputation of all conservative Americans by sort of leading the Republican Party to its grave. And it's really interesting to see all of that, especially sad because in a way he played his part. And I wonder if from the very beginning, since 2015, since 2016, I wonder if this was the end goal, or is just a transformation that occurred within him. I mean, this is something for even historians to analyze in light of all the events that have recently transpired. It is, I think, very sad. So, all things considered, I do want to mention one. If you are ever speaking to, and I mean the listeners, if you're speaking to some sort of like top MAGA patriot who says Iran is the greatest sponsor of terror, just for reference, okay? And I know some American MAGA people, they do respect Vladimir Putin's power. Remember the whole Anchorage meeting of Vladimir Putin respectfully shaking hands with Donald J. Trump. So in some ways, there is that respect for Russia. Well, who carries out the terror strikes on Russian territory? Zelensky and Budanov, the SBU clown, these Ukrainian terrorists, right? Trump is a Zelensky skeptic, at least he appears to be. Well, what has Zelensky recently done? He literally visited Damascus and hung out with former Al-Qaeda, former ISIS, HTS leader al-Sharaa, but that won't stop Trump. So Trump claiming Iran is the main sponsor of terror in light of literally these two terrorists hanging out in occupied Damascus this week was completely just preposterous, insane. And I think just you have to call out these contradictions if you ever do speak to any like diehard MAGA people, just to maybe shed some light, open their eyes to the reality that this political rhetoric from Trump really is at the very least baseless, and then build on from there. So call out contradictions, and hopefully that will open and sober some people up. But thank you everyone for listening. I mean, it's been an insane episode. Obviously, so much news is still breaking, Conrad. It's been a very, very eventful week and day, to be fair.
No, it very much has, and I wouldn't be surprised if more things continue to break. Obviously, we'll keep the Telegram updated, but most important thing is to pray for the world. That's how you can influence things positively. $2 from Silversight, praying for you, Dmitry, and everyone in the chat. Thank you very much. And with all of that, I want to encourage everybody, if you're not already behind the paywall, worldwarnow.co, get behind the paywall, support the show. Obviously, this is my full-time job. This is the only way that I make an income is through the Substack, through the Buy Me a Coffee, through your super chats. So thank you to everyone that super chatted, specifically Jonathan Kelly, Solid Snake, Paisio Sevillo, Ewar Mapping, Aaron Ehart, Andrew Palamos, Silversight, and Israel S. Thank you all so much for your support. And again, get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co. Click the Ether Hour tab to get access to all of this. Like I said, tomorrow, the Q&A episode where you all asked your questions will be being released. So there will be new Ether Hour content. It's already been recorded. So be prepared for that. You can be entertained during any of your free time between all of the services recently. Be sure to visit the Buy Me a Coffee as well, buymeacoffee.com/World War Now. A lot of people have supported this area. You can support us with a one-time donation. You can become a recurring donor there as well. But if you're already a supporter and want to keep giving, this is one of the best ways to do it. Obviously, subscribe to the YouTube channel where you're watching, or if you're watching on X or Substack, like this stream, whether you're watching the replay or not. Share it with anyone who you think might find it interesting. Follow us on X at World War Now _. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. One other shilling thing I want to do, I forgot about this. We do have a Clips account on X. So if you could follow at WWN Clips, that would be very helpful. A lot of great clips posted every day on there. So if you don't want to tune into the whole long streams, you can get a lot of segments from our interview with Defense Minister of Lebanon, former Defense Minister of Lebanon, Yaqub Saraf, already some clips from my stream with Dr. David Patrick Harry and some others. So at WWN Clips on Twitter. Follow us on Instagram as well. I don't know how to pull that up immediately right here, but go to Instagram and look up World War Now. You can find us on there. Instagram, I've started to post. So yeah, there's also a World War Now Clips YouTube channel. I should be sharing some posts from there on the World War Now channel on the posts section soon. So check all of that out. Thank you again all so much for supporting the show. Like, subscribe, share, all of those things. worldwarnow.co is the home base. And with all of that, we will see you on the next one. God bless, and may you all have a blessed Pascha.